A 6-year-old boy sat beneath the twilight branches of a sacred tree and told the Force he would be the greatest Jedi who ever lived. But the Force didn't answer him. It listened, quietly, patiently, as if it already knew. This is the story of Freedon Nadd, the shadow that refused to die. Long before he was called Sith, before Onderon bled his name into history, he was only a boy with a gift the Jedi couldn't ignore, and a hunger they couldn't see. He was born in a quiet system, far from the war-torn mid-rim. The records do not speak of his parents, not their names, not their fates. Only that he was taken early, a child of 5, strong in the Force, brought to Ossus during one of the High Republic's more stable decades. There were no wars then, no Sith empires, only quiet study, ancient halls, and the hum of lightsabers drawn in peace. Ossus, the great archive world of the Jedi Order, welcomed him with open arms, and the boy welcomed it in return. He learned quickly, memorized faster. And when his peers meditated, he listened not just to the Force, but to their thoughts, their feelings, their fears. He didn't speak much, but he remembered everything. The Jedi Masters saw it as promise, that quiet control, that fierce devotion. But they misread the stillness. They mistook it for humility. What they didn't see, what the Force whispered, but the Council ignored, was the way his heart clenched each time praise was given to someone else. They didn't see the storm beneath the surface. At 12, he built his first lightsaber with no assistance. At 13, he bested his training master in a sparring match, using nothing but the Force to predict his movements. At 14, he meditated for 3 days without sleep, unlocking visions that scared the elder seers into silence. Still, he waited for one word. Master. It never came. Freedon Nadd's early years were not defined by failure. They were defined by quiet victories. Victories that no one feared, no one questioned, because the Order did not fear excellence, only passion. But Freedon Nadd was not like other Jedi. He didn't seek serenity. He calculated it. And when others let go of emotion to serve the light, Nadd learned to hide emotion to protect his place. He was a brilliant liar, not because he wanted to deceive, but because he believed the truth would never be accepted. He believed greatness required secrecy. As he aged into knighthood, he left Ossus and wandered the wider galaxy, helping settlements, breaking up crime networks, arbitrating border conflicts. To the galaxy, he was a hero. To the Order, a rising star. But in the private silences of hyperspace, he meditated on things the Jedi never taught him. The names of the ancients, the scars in the Force, the faint echoes of power lost to time. He read everything. The dawn of the Jedi, the fall of the Rakata, the dark Jedi exiles. Not for fascination, for pattern. Because even as he served the Republic, he watched the way Jedi Masters held back, how they guided with restraint, governed with indecision, and shied away from victory when it came too easily. And though he never said it aloud, the belief began to take root, that if the Force made him this powerful, why shouldn't he use all of it? Years passed, his skill deepened, his connection to the Force grew so strong that even the Council began to speak of him with a cautious awe. But awe is not the same as trust. And when the moment came, the moment he believed would change everything, the Council sat in silence. They did not grant him the rank of Master. There was no trial, no explanation, only a subtle lowering of eyes, a quiet shake of a head. and one sentence spoken by an elder whose name history has long since forgotten. Your path is not yet clear. That was the day something shifted in Freedon Nadd. He bowed, he thanked them, and when he turned to leave, he smiled, not in peace, but in prophecy, because deep within him, a promise was born in silence, a vow the Jedi never heard, but the Force did, and it would never forget. The halls of Ossus felt different when he returned, not darker, not colder, just smaller. Freedon Nadd walked those marble corridors like a man already written out of their future. He did not argue. He did not plead. He simply studied the Jedi around him and saw them for the first time not as brothers or mentors, but as ghosts. They had trained him to listen to the Force, but never to listen to himself. He was 32, a Jedi Knight, undefeated in duels, praised by senators, trusted by peacekeepers. And still, they saw something missing. A fault, a shadow, a silence he could not name. He searched for it obsessively, that invisible flaw they sensed but never spoke of. He fasted, he meditated, he isolated himself in the caverns below Ossus, where ancient holocrons whispered in fragments. Still, the answer eluded him. Your path is not yet clear. He heard it in every word spoken to others, every title bestowed, every master who looked away when he entered a room. The other Jedi whispered now, not in malice, but concern. They said he was pushing too hard, that his ambition was clouding his attunement, that perhaps he wasn't meant for the High Council after all. But they didn't understand. He never wanted power for himself. He wanted the freedom to use it. He wanted to heal worlds without waiting for permission, to intervene before peace collapsed, to act without standing before a tribunal each time his instincts defied tradition. They had told him the Force would guide him. But the Force, as he knew it, was quiet now. It no longer whispered. It watched. So he asked the one question no Jedi dares to ask. What if they're wrong? What if the Council, the codes, the balance they spoke of were not truths of the galaxy, but rituals of a fading order? What if the Force was not a master to obey, but a weapon to wield? It was not a thought he spoke aloud, but it lived inside him now, heavy, constant, like a truth waiting to be born. The final fracture came during a mission on Jorax II, a colony world suffering under plague and civil unrest. A small band of revolutionaries had turned to dark rituals, using forbidden alchemy to curse the city's food supply. Freedon Nadd found them in a mountain temple. They were not warriors, not Sith, just desperate outcasts clutching fragments of lost power. The High Council's orders were clear: intervene, detain, return them alive. But Nadd didn't hesitate. He killed them all. Every one. Not out of hatred, not vengeance, but mercy. Because in that moment, he felt something deeper than guilt. Clarity. He had acted decisively, correctly. The plague ended, the city was saved. And for the first time in years, the Force spoke to him again. Not in words, in release, but when he returned to Ossus, he was met with silence. Not praise, not condemnation, just disappointment. Just that same sentence again. Your path is not yet clear. That night, Freedon Nadd stood before the statue of Onderon, one of the ancient Jedi historians. He stared into those lifeless stone eyes and asked the Force one final question. If they will not teach me, who will? The wind moved, the stars flickered, and deep in the back of his mind, something answered. Not with a voice, with a pull, toward a world long buried, a name long erased, a legacy waiting in the shadows. Freedon Nadd did not sleep that night, and in the morning, he was gone. Gone from Ossus, gone from the Order, gone from everything he once swore to protect. But he was not lost. He had simply begun listening to something older than Jedi, and far more patient. The stars stretched endlessly before him, silent, watching. Freedon Nadd no longer wore the Jedi robes. He traveled alone, unspoken, through the ancient spine of the galaxy, chasing echoes of a power no council had dared to name. He no longer sought their approval, only answers. His ship drifted through forgotten sectors, tracing patterns in the Force that didn't follow logic. He studied ruins older than the Republic, listened to survivors of cults long vanished, followed whispers of a temple that did not appear on any map. Time blurred, his mind quieted, and still the Force pulled him forward, until it led him to Ambria, a dead world, cracked, ashen, cursed. Centuries ago, a Jedi healer had tried to cleanse its dark side taint. She failed. The poison was buried, not destroyed, and beneath its still surface, Freedon Nadd felt it. Not an artifact, not a ruin, a presence. He walked alone across black glass plains where no life stirred, and there, in the hollow of a sunken crater, he found a vault sealed not by metal but by will. A Sith vault. The name etched in stone had eroded, but the Force whispered it clearly. Naga Sadow, a fallen Sith Lord of the old Empire, a master of alchemy, illusion, and war. Exiled after the Great Hyperspace War, but not dead. His tomb was not a grave. It was a prison, and Freedon Nadd opened it. The darkness did not attack him. It recognized him. A voice moved through the air, not sound, but memory, a consciousness suspended by rage. It asked no questions. It offered no warnings. It only said, "You came for what they would not give you." Freedon Nadd knelt, not out of submission, but understanding. He had found what the Jedi feared, and it was waiting for him. Naga Sadow was not alive, but he was not gone. His spirit clung to this place, tied by the rituals of a forgotten Sith technique. And in that twilight between death and eternity, he taught. Not lessons, truths, of how the Jedi had driven the Dark Jedi from Tython. How those exiles founded the Sith Empire. How strength was punished, not rewarded, by the Republic's order. Freedon Nadd listened. Every word was a fracture being healed, every truth an answer to the fault no Jedi could name. He learned the rituals of Sith alchemy, the forging of holocrons, the bloodlines of Korriban, the power of pain. But the most important lesson came in silence, in the space between thoughts. The Sith did not serve the Force. They bent it. They did not seek harmony. They shaped chaos. And as Nadd repeated these ancient incantations beneath the scorched surface of Ambria, something inside him bloomed. Not rage, recognition. He was not becoming someone else. He was returning to what he had always been. The Jedi had taught him to feel shame for his instincts. The Sith taught him to honor them. On the final night of his training, Sadow's spirit gave him a gift, a red kyber crystal, taken from a fallen Jedi and corrupted through weeks of ritual bleeding. Freedon Nadd placed it in a new hilt. When he ignited the blade, it did not scream, it breathed. And for the first time, so did he. He was not a Jedi, not a Sith Lord, not yet, but he was no longer uncertain. The Force did not bind him anymore. It bent around him. It waited to be told what to do. And with the ancient teachings of Naga Sadow burned into his blood, he was ready to decide what came next. He could have stayed. Ambria was quiet now, obedient. The tomb had given him what he needed. The rituals were complete. Naga Sadow's voice, once constant, had begun to fade, not in strength, but in purpose. The ancient Sith had given him everything he knew, and he knew what came next. To complete the path, Freedon Nadd would have to walk it alone. When he returned to his ship, the stars looked different. Not distant, open. He plotted no course. The Force would lead. But he understood now what the Jedi never saw. There were no destinations, only moments. And the next moment was death. He did not grieve for Sadow. He did not thank him. He killed him. With words, not weapons. With will, not war. He stood above the tomb and severed the tether. A ritual older than language, cutting spirit from stone, master from world. And as the echoes of Sadow screamed one final time into the void, Freedon Nadd stood silent and free. Not as an apprentice, not as a shadow, as something new. He was no longer following history. He was history. The galaxy did not feel him return. There was no explosion, no warship, no declaration. Just a man cloaked in simple robes, walking among systems too far for the Republic to care about. But wherever he went, the dark side grew louder. He visited ancient temples on Ambria and Vijun, touched the scorched soil of Malachor. He even passed through the deep core where the Force trembled like a wound, and the old Sith spirits whispered not in words, but fear. They knew his name now, and they did not mock it. Still, something was missing. He had learned the Sith ways, but he had not yet proven them. And he knew the Jedi were watching. Not openly, not yet. But the Order had always feared what it could not control. So he waited. He became a myth, a traveler, a whisper across trade lanes and forgotten outposts. He spoke little, but listened often, until he found it. A world cut off from the galaxy. Wild, war-torn, brutal. Onderon. It was everything the Jedi had tried to prevent. A planet ruled by fear, divided by centuries of blood feuds. Beasts roamed the wilderness. Royals ruled from stone towers, barely holding back the chaos. No senate, no council, no balance, just raw survival. Freedon Nadd stepped into that world like a shadow passing through fire. And for the first time, he smiled without restraint. Because here, finally, was a place that would not resist him. It would welcome him. Not as a Jedi, not as a teacher, but as something far older. He did not conquer Onderon through violence. He seduced it. With power, with vision, with truth. He showed them how to control fear, how to turn suffering into strength, how to bend the Force to will. And they listened, because they had nothing else. In less than a year, he had married into the royal bloodline. In 2, he ruled it. And somewhere beneath the palace, he began building a tomb. Not for his body, not yet. For his legacy. He would not be forgotten. He would not fade. He had been denied the rank of master. But on Onderon, he was already something far greater. A king, a god, a shadow that would never leave. There are places in the galaxy that feel like wounds. Ambria was one of them. To the Jedi, it was a forgotten graveyard, a failure best left unspoken. To the Republic, it didn't exist. And to the Force, it was a scar that never healed. Freedon Nadd felt it before he saw it. A pressure in his chest. A silence that wasn't quiet but emptied. As if the Force had once screamed here and never fully stopped. Ambria didn't rotate like it should. Its weather didn't move like a normal planet. And its surface cracked, flat, and glassed from heat told the story the Order refused to preserve. Centuries ago, a Jedi healer named Thon had tried to cleanse the dark energy here. He failed. The rituals sealed the corruption deep beneath the crust, binding it inside the Lake Nath, a still, dead pool of water surrounded by black sand and broken stone. The Force there did not flow. It waited. Freedon Nadd stood at its edge without speaking. He hadn't come for records. He hadn't come for healing. He had come for what was buried. It had been calling to him for weeks, pulling at his thoughts during hyperspace. In dreams, in silence. He walked the lake's perimeter in slow circles, meditating without words, not searching with the Force listening to it. And somewhere beneath the surface, he felt eyes. They weren't watching. They were waiting. The tomb was not marked by temples or monuments. There were no spires, no carvings, no guards. Only a hollow in the rock, a smooth, unnatural formation near the northern basin, hidden beneath a collapsed ridge. It hadn't been built. It had been sealed. He entered alone, dragging no supplies, speaking no oaths. The temperature dropped with every step. And then, it stopped. The air grew still, thicker. He had crossed into a place the Force did not reach. But remembered. The walls were lined with carvings, but they weren't in basic. They were written in pure Sith. Not just the language. The energy. Every glyph vibrated with pain, like each letter had been carved from a scream. And in the center of the chamber sat a figure. Not a body, not entirely. It was more like armor around a void, robes frozen in place, a crown made of bone and crystal fused to a half-human skull. There was no breath, no movement. And yet, Freedon Nadd bowed, not in submission, in recognition. This was Naga Sado, the last of the ancient Sith Lords, exiled, entombed, waiting, and he was not alone. As Nadd opened himself to the Force, he didn't feel presence. He felt memory, so deep and compressed it had become sentient. Not alive, but awake, and it had been waiting for him. A voice unfolded around him, old, distorted, cracking like wind through stone. It said no name, asked no question. It simply said, "I see you." Freedon Nadd didn't speak. He didn't need to. He had come to learn. And something inside this tomb had come to teach. But not for free. There were no tests, no ceremonies. Only silence. And then, a cold whisper in his mind. "If you are to take my throne, you must bleed for it." And Freedon Nadd smiled. Because this was not the voice of a teacher. It was the voice of a rival, and he had been preparing for this moment his entire life. The tomb did not test him with traps or puzzles. It tested him with truth. Days passed, or maybe weeks. Time inside the cavern was meaningless. There was no sun, no night, only the steady weight of memory pressing into his chest. Naga Sado did not appear as a ghost. He did not glow. He did not smile. He was a voice, a shape behind the mind, an echo that refused to fade. At first, the spirit said little. It listened. It watched. Freedon Nadd meditated beneath the carved ceiling. He fasted beside the black stone altar. He studied the inscriptions by touch and light, burning them into memory. The lessons came in fragments, images, pain. Visions of Yavin IV in flame, of Sith warriors marching under crimson banners, of golden temples collapsing beneath Jedi bombardment. But the visions weren't just history. They were invitations. Nadd didn't flinch. He welcomed each one, even the agony. He asked questions not like a student, but like a future rival. What had ended the Sith Empire? What weakness allowed their betrayal? Why had Sado fled instead of fighting to the death? The voice didn't answer right away. It laughed. So bold, so proud. You ask questions with no fear. And Freedon Nadd replied without hesitation. Because fear is for the defeated. The tomb trembled, just slightly. That night, or what passed for night in that buried place, the carvings began to move. Not physically, not visibly, but Nadd felt them watching. Like every line on the wall had become an eye. Like the past was judging him, testing his worth without words. The next trial came without warning. The air grew colder, the darkness deeper, and suddenly, Nadd felt himself split. His consciousness was torn sideways, flung into a vision more vivid than any he had endured before. He stood inside a great hall on Korriban, watching Sith Lords kneel to Sado as he raised a blade of blood-red light. And then in a blink he was in Sado's place, wielding the blade, wearing the crown, but he wasn't alone. Before him stood his own image, a shadow version, cloaked in Jedi robes, holding a blue saber. Not a ghost, a memory of who he had once been. They fought not with power, but with conviction. One side, calm, measured, righteous. The other, furious, liberated, burning. The battle wasn't long, because Freedon Nadd didn't hesitate. He cut down the Jedi in one stroke, and when the vision ended, he was back in the tomb, kneeling, sweating, laughing, because the test hadn't been about combat. It had been about choice, and he had chosen clarity. The voice of Sado returned. Now I see you. The spirit began to speak more after that. It taught him how to fracture his presence across shadows, how to conceal his power from Jedi senses, how to pull pain from the Force like heat from fire. But the lessons weren't free. Each ritual left scars. His body shook from the alchemical rites. His voice darkened. His sleep vanished. And still, he thanked the darkness. Because in this place, he was no longer being questioned. He was becoming. No counsel, no judgment, no holding back. Just the Force, raw, real, uncaged. And the Sith, who watched from the stone, knew exactly what he was creating. The spirit of Naga Sado changed once it accepted him. It no longer spoke as a whisper behind the mind. It moved like a shadow beside him, cold, watchful, hungry. Freedon Nadd felt the shift first in his breath, then in his bones, and finally in the force itself, which bent around him like heat around a flame. The tomb was no longer silent. It pulsed. Every lesson became harsher, every ritual deeper. The walls seemed to tighten, drawing him deeper into the forgotten heart of the Sith Empire. The air beneath the altar cracked open one day, revealing a chamber older than the Republic. Nadd stepped inside, and the smell of ash and scorched metal filled his lungs. This was not a place of teaching. It was a place of creation. A forge. Not for weapons, for Sith. Here, Sado had shaped soldiers who could bend gravity, twist minds, and shatter stone with thought alone. Here, he had bled the Force into living flesh. And here, Freedon Nadd was asked to do the same. The ritual began with a circle of carved symbols, each one tied to the dark side like a vein. He sat inside it, palms open, eyes closed. Then the chamber came alive. The symbols ignited with red light. The air thickened into mist, and the Force slammed into him like a breaking wave. It wasn't pain. It was drowning. Every regret, every failure, every moment the Jedi had denied him, all of it crushed down on him. He saw Ossus again. He saw the Council's quiet disappointment. He saw his own reflection in the eyes of masters who had never understood him. He tried to breathe. He couldn't. And then the voice of Sado cut through the storm. Break or become. Freedon Nadd didn't break. He tore the vision apart. He pulled in the dark side like a starving man, ripping strength from every scar inside him. He rose to his feet slowly, trembling, refusing to fall. The mist fell away. The symbols dimmed, and the ritual room went silent. When he opened his eyes, he was not the same. His aura had changed, sharp, heavy, violent. Not like a Sith Lord. Not yet. But like a man who could become one. Naga Sado appeared then, not as a shape, but as pressure like the weight of a planet, leaning into his thoughts. You were a Jedi once. Freedon Nadd didn't answer. And still, you hold back. Nadd felt his jaw tighten. He felt the echo of that old discipline, the chains the Order had wrapped around his soul. Sado pressed harder. If you keep even a fragment of who you were, you will die as they did. A wave of memory crashed into him, images of fallen Sith, broken by doubt, crushed under their own hesitation. The message was clear. To rise, he had to cut out the last piece of the Jedi still inside him. So he did. He sat in meditation and shattered the final bond, the calmness he had learned as a child, the quiet acceptance drilled into him on Ossus, the belief that the Force had a will that he must obey. He rejected all of it. The break was violent, a tearing, ripping sensation that felt like losing a limb. But when it was done, he felt whole, not serene, not balanced, certain. The chamber trembled not from the ritual, but from Naga Sado's amusement. Now, the spirit said, you may call yourself my heir. Freedon Nadd breathed out slowly. The air tasted different now, like fire, like metal, like freedom. He didn't bow. He didn't kneel. He simply stood there tall, steady, unbroken. And for the first time since Sado's death, the ancient Sith Lord felt something he had not felt in centuries. Respect. The deeper Freedon Nadd walked into the tomb. the more he understood a truth the Jedi had tried to hide from him his entire life. Power was never given. It was taken. And Naga Sadow had given him everything not out of kindness but calculation. The ancient Sith Lord wanted an heir, a legacy, a vessel to carry his name through the centuries he could no longer touch. But Nadd had not come to be a vessel. He had come to replace him. The final test arrived without warning. The ground shook as if something beneath the crust awoke in anger. The air thickened, and Sadow's presence filled the chamber like a storm, pressing against Nadd's skull. Images smashed into his mind: armies kneeling, temples burning, Jedi falling beneath red blades. Not visions, commands. "You will carry my throne," the voice boomed. "You will rebuild what I lost." Freedon Nadd stood unmoving, his breath slow, his heartbeat calm. "No," he said quietly. The tomb froze. The darkness recoiled, then rushed forward in fury. Sadow's spirit surged at him, a tidal swell of rage, memory, and ancient power. Not a ghost, not a hallucination, a will, a Sith Lord refusing to fade. Freedon Nadd's knees buckled under the pressure, his lungs strained, his vision blurred. The stones around him cracked from the weight of that spiritual assault. Sadow had been dead for centuries, but in this tomb, he was still a hurricane of force energy, capable of crushing the mind of any living Jedi. But Nadd was no Jedi. He reached deeper than he ever had before, pulling strength from every ritual, every scar, every fracture the tomb had carved into him. He pushed back, not with light, but with ownership. "This is not your empire anymore." At that moment, the chamber erupted into darkness. Not Shadow's darkness so pure it felt alive. It wrapped around him, pushed into him, tried to hollow him out. Sadow screamed through the force, his voice shaking the stone. "I made you." Nadd's voice came out steady, cold, final. "No, you revealed me." He unleashed a wave of dark side energy, so focused it split the floor beneath them. The pressure tore through the tomb, slamming into the core of Sadow's spirit like a blade of pure will. The ancient Sith Lord staggered not physically, but in essence. His form flickered, his presence fractured. Nadd stepped forward, then another step, then another. Each footfall broke more of the tether that bound Sadow to the physical realm. "You escaped death once," Nadd whispered, "but you will not escape me." He raised both hands and drew the force into a single point between his palms, a sphere of cold, crushing gravity. A technique the Jedi feared. A technique the Sith perfected. And he released it. The chamber exploded with silent light, erasing stone, inscriptions, echoes, and the last remnant of the ancient Sith Emperor's will. When the energy faded, only dust remained. Naga Sadow was gone, truly gone. Not sealed, not chained, destroyed. Freedon Nadd stood alone in the smoking ruin, his breath slow, his eyes calm, and for the first time since entering this tomb, there was no voice in his mind but his own. He walked back toward the surface, leaving the shattered remains of the Sith Empire behind him. Not as an apprentice, not as a servant, not even as a successor. He had killed his master. He had claimed his power, and he was ready to build something greater. Ambria's poisoned winds greeted him as he stepped into the dying light. The sky burned orange. The lake rippled with ancient fear. But Freedon Nadd did not look back. The darkness beneath Ambria no longer belonged to Naga Sado. It belonged to him. The galaxy was quiet when Freedon Nadd returned. Not peaceful, just unaware. He did not come in fire. He came in silence. And the dark side moved with him. Ambria was behind him now. Buried. Changed. Naga Sado was dead, not exiled. Not faded, destroyed by the very apprentice he thought he could control. But Freedon Nadd wasn't seeking revenge. He didn't need to. He had already won. What he carried now was older than power. It was proof. Proof that he had looked into the heart of the ancient Sith and survived. Proof that he had been broken, remade, and sharpened in the void. He no longer saw stars the way others did. They were no longer lights. They were temptations. Each one a world. Each one a chance to spread what the Jedi tried to bury. He began his journey not with armies but with secrets. On the mid-rim world of Tavia, he approached a cult that worshipped Force storms. They bowed in silence, and then tore out their eyes. On Denaba, he spent a night in the crypt beneath the Jedi archives. By morning, one of the holocrons had vanished, and when he reached the ruins of ancient Korriban, he did not tremble. He knelt beside the shattered bones of a junta pole, and whispered a name only the dead remembered. His own. Because he no longer belonged to the Jedi Order. He no longer belonged to Naga Sado. He belonged to the Sith, not as an heir, but as a force. Still, there was one thing left undone. One thread uncut. One lesson incomplete. In truth, he had never been truly Sith. Not yet. Not until the one who gave him the darkness died by his hand. The spirit of Sado had faded, yes, but his tomb still remained. His artifacts, his holocrons, his legacy. If another acolyte ever found them, the story could begin again. So Freedon Nadd turned his ship toward Ambria one final time. When he landed, the winds screamed against the hull like they remembered him. He walked the sands of Lake Nath slowly, calmly, like a man returning not to a grave, but to a duel. A duel only one of them knew was coming. Inside the tomb, the silence was complete. No echo, no light, but something still lingered. He felt it in the cracks, in the pressure behind his eyes. The last sliver of Sado, clinging to stone, trying to be forgotten. And Nadd spoke, not in basic, but in pure Sith. Your legacy ends now. He gathered the Force into his palms, focused it, turned it inward, not as a weapon of rage, but finality. This wasn't punishment, it was closure. And with a single gesture, he collapsed the tomb inward. The ceiling cracked, the walls shook, the carved names of the old Sith buckled into dust. Freedon Nadd stepped back, watching as centuries of Sith pride crumbled into ash. There was no scream, only the wind. And then, nothing. The darkness beneath Ambria was no longer ancient. It was his. He left without looking back. He had not inherited Sado's empire. He had erased it. And in its place, he had become something far more dangerous. A Sith with no leash, no throne, no past, only purpose. And as he vanished into the stars once more, the Force began to tremble. Because what Nadd carried now was not just power, it was hunger, and it would never sleep again. It wasn't just the teachings that made Freedon Nadd dangerous. It was what he built from them. The Sith were known for war, for terror, for thrones of stone and blood. But Nadd began differently. He started with a blade, not a weapon, a symbol. Forged on the outskirts of Onderon, in a cave that had never seen sunlight, Nadd carved it with no one watching. The components were simple, but the process was not. He called it Villa, an old Sith word meaning truth given form. And in the ritual, he bled the crystal until it cracked under his will, not in rage, but in memory. Every denial from the Jedi, every silence from Ossus, every whispered command from Naga Sadow, he pressed all of it into the heart of the crystal. And when it screamed, he smiled, because now it belonged to him. When he ignited it for the first time, the cave filled with red light so deep it seemed to pull sound out of the air. It didn't buzz like a Jedi saber. It hummed like something alive. And it whispered his name back to him. Not as a title, not as a warning, as a fact. He wasn't practicing the dark side anymore. He was the dark side. The hilt was wrapped in soft black leather, soaked in ash from Sadow's destroyed tomb. The emitter was curved, built for precision, not brute force. It was a weapon for someone who didn't waste motion. Someone who struck once and ended everything. He didn't show it to anyone. Not yet. Because before it could be a symbol to others, it had to be a promise to himself. That he would never kneel again. That he would never be someone else's apprentice. That he would write the next chapter of the Sith, alone. He traveled for months afterward, never staying in one place long enough to be hunted. But every world he touched, the darkness followed. On Tainted, he stood at the edge of the old Jedi ruins and left a single cut in the stone, a mark deeper than the Republic's memory. On Dromund Kars, he walked the swamps in silence and listened to the madness of a world still soaked in dark rituals. On Zayast, he didn't speak. He only left a grave, and in it, a name, his own, as if to say, I am not a shadow of your past. I am the beginning of your future. The blade never left his side. Not when he meditated. Not when he slept. Because it wasn't a tool. It was a reminder that he had murdered a Sith Lord, not in vengeance, but necessity. The blade didn't make him powerful. It reflected what he had become. He didn't give it to an apprentice. He didn't display it in a temple, because he had no need to prove anything anymore. He simply was. And when the time came when someone dared to challenge him, to question his right to claim the dark side, he said nothing. He let the blade speak. One strike, no noise, no cruelty, only certainty. And the silence that followed was always deeper than before, as if the Force itself paused to listen. Because the moment Freedon Nadd drew his saber, the galaxy remembered something it had tried to forget. That darkness does not need to roar. Sometimes, it only needs to whisper. There were no banners when he arrived. No salutes, no songs. Only stone and silence. Onderon wasn't a Sith world. It wasn't even a Republic one. It was wild, wounded, half-civilized, ruled by a people who barely remembered the galaxy they came from. The city of Izzy stood like a broken tooth in the jungle, surrounded by death, filled with fear. Its kings were little more than warlords. Its nobles clung to superstition. And beyond its walls, the beasts waited. Freedon Nadd walked into the capital with no escort, no claim, no permission, and no one stopped him. They say he spoke to the king only once. A conversation that lasted less than an hour. No one knows what was said, but when it ended, the old king never sat the throne again. Nadd didn't take power by force. He took it by presence. He became advisor, then priest, then ruler. And when the people looked into his eyes, they didn't see a man. They saw something older, a spirit wearing skin, a shadow with a name. He didn't call himself Sith, not out loud, but his teachings spread like roots beneath the city. Rituals returned. The dark side became prayer. Fear became currency. And the palace began to change. At its center, beneath the throne, he built a hall carved from the bones of forgotten catacombs, layered in obsidian, veined with crimson ore. The Temple of the Forgotten Kings. It wasn't for worship. It was for memory. Because Nadd knew something the Jedi had forgotten. That power fades when it isn't anchored. That legacies rot when they aren't preserved. So, he filled the temple with more than artifacts. He filled it with himself, his thoughts, his regrets, his victories, his darkness. Every stone, a whisper. Every corridor, a scar. He taught the royal bloodline to listen, not just to him, to the Force, to the pain beneath it. He didn't promise them salvation. He promised purpose. They learned quickly, too quickly. The nobles began to change. Eyes that had once been hollow with fear now shimmered with ambition. And Nadd, he let them, because he knew what it meant. To be Sith was to inspire betrayal, to feed it, to survive it. And so, even as the bloodline he had shaped began to grow teeth, he smiled. Because he had planted something no rebellion could uproot. An echo. The temple breathed now. Not literally, but through those who walked its halls. Each step they took in darkness, each ritual they performed in secret, fed it, made it stronger, deeper. And Nadd watched. From the throne, from the shadows, from behind the eyes of every ruler who knelt to him. He never wore a crown. He didn't need one. Because he had become something more dangerous than a king. A myth that was still alive. And myths, when written in blood and stone, never fade. The deeper Freedon Nadd sank his roots into Onderon. The more the darkness inside him changed. It no longer whispered. It no longer surged. It waited. Like a beast resting beneath the floorboards of his mind, patient and certain that the door would open again. Power had never frightened him. But this felt different. He felt it most in the quiet moments at dawn, when the city was still, or at night, when the jungle outside Izzy's roared like a wounded world. The dark side did not sleep with him. It breathed with him. Every inhale tasted like storm. Every exhale felt heavier than the last. He told himself it was strength, a sign that he was growing, a reward for destroying Naga Sadow. But the truth was simpler. He had taken something from the ancient tomb. Not an artifact. Not a lesson. A burden. Darkness that didn't just empower. It clung. It began with small things. He would wake from meditation with his hands shaking, though no emotion touched him. His shadow stretched wrong in torchlight, a fraction too long, a fraction too alive. Sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he saw the tomb again. Not as memory, as invitation. But Freedon Nadd was not a man who turned away from what frightened him. He confronted it. He walked the palace at night, letting the shadows drip off the walls, listening to the city below. He visited the beasts beyond the walls, letting them circle him, letting their hunger reflect his own. He meditated in the temple he had carved, alone, deep enough that the air tasted like metal. And every time, he felt the same thing. Something was following him. Not Sado, not the spirits of Korriban, not the anger of the Jedi he had abandoned. Something older, something patient, something that had watched him long before Ambria. The dark side itself, not as a teacher, not as a rival, as a claim. It seeped into the throne room, settling like dust. It filled the corridors of the palace, coating every stone. It wound itself around the royal bloodline, threading through marriages, children, heirs. This was the curse he had brought home, not a punishment, but a price. A stain that wouldn't wash out. Every ruler that came after him would feel it. Every heir of Onderon would carry a shadow they didn't earn. Every choice they made would taste faintly of him. Because darkness doesn't disappear when conquered. It relocates. And Freedon Nadd, in his rise, in his triumph, in his murder of the Sith Lord who made him, had become its willing vessel. He felt the curse deepen during one storm-filled night, when the sky cracked open with purple lightning. He stood at the edge of the royal balcony, watching Izzy sleep, feeling the dark side pulse through the clouds. His skin prickled, his mind tightened, and for a moment he felt himself slip not into rage, not into fear, but into a quiet, cold clarity. He realized something the Jedi had feared, something Sado had hidden, something the ancient Sith had only whispered. You don't wield the dark side. You open yourself to it. And once opened, it never closes. He exhaled slowly, letting the truth settle. He was not being consumed. He was being claimed. Onderon didn't just have a king now. It had a conduit, a channel for the dark side to bleed through. A curse disguised as a ruler. Freedon Nadd turned away from the storm, cloak trailing behind him, steps echoing softly through the stone hall. He didn't fear what followed him. He accepted it. Because he understood what the Jedi never could. To change a world, you must let the darkness change you. Onderon was not a planet. It was a wound, cut off from the wider galaxy, scarred by war, hemorrhaging fear. Freedon Nadd stepped onto its surface, not as a conqueror, but as a shadow drawn to pain. The force felt wild here, not corrupted, but uncontrolled. The jungle roared like a mind unraveling. The skies cracked open without warning. And the city of Izis, surrounded by beasts and stone, stood like a half-forgotten memory of civilization. But Nadd did not fear chaos. He had lived inside it for years. And now, he saw it clearly, not as disorder, but opportunity. The planet was still ruled by monarchs, but their power was brittle. Their bloodlines steeped in isolation, superstition, and unspoken rituals. A single dynasty had clung to the throne for generations, but it was fractured. And worse, it was afraid. Afraid of the jungle beyond the walls. Afraid of the beasts that roamed the night. Afraid of what their own ancestors had buried beneath the palace. Fear like that didn't need to be overthrown. It only needed to be understood. Freedon Nadd made no demands. He arrived in silence. A traveler, a mystic, a man with no name but presence. They brought him before the king out of curiosity. But the moment they stood face to face, the throne room fell still. The ruler saw something in him, something ancient. Not just power, but memory. It said the king asked Nadd only one question. "What are you?" And Nadd only whispered, "What you were meant to become." That night, the monarch didn't sleep, and by dawn, Nadd had been granted a chamber in the palace. Days passed, then weeks. He did not seize control. He made himself necessary. He spoke of the Force in ways the royal sages had forgotten. He healed wounds without medicine. He lit fires with no flame. And more than once, he stood at the edge of the jungle, where the beasts watched from the trees and they turned away. The people began to whisper, not in fear, in awe, and the king began to listen. What Nadd gave them wasn't domination. It was relevance. He showed them that their world wasn't cursed. It was chosen. A place where the Force still burned raw and primal, untamed by Republic laws, unseen by Jedi eyes. He explained the storms as energy, the beasts as guardians, the chaos as a gift, waiting to be unwrapped, and he wrapped it all in reverence. He never called himself Sith, never demanded worship. He simply taught, and in doing so, he infected the throne. The king leaned on him, then trusted him. And when Nadd asked to build a chamber beneath the palace, no one objected. It began as a private sanctum, but soon it became more. An archive of Sith knowledge, a temple in all but name. The city above remained the same stone towers, flickering torches, tight alleyways, but underneath it all, the real kingdom was being built, not in walls, in minds. And Freedon Nadd, once cast aside by the Jedi, once exiled from the tomb of his master, had found something far more enduring than vengeance. He had found a people willing to believe, and through belief, he would rule them forever. Power doesn't always sit on the throne. Sometimes, it waits beneath it. Freedon Nadd had no interest in ceremony. He wore no royal robes, issued no decrees, claimed no titles. He didn't need to, because every decision the king made began with a glance toward him. He had become the silence behind the voice, the hand behind the law, the shadow beneath the crown, and slowly, the people stopped asking what his role was. They simply obeyed. His influence spread like roots under stone, invisible at first, but patient, permanent. In the court, nobles began to speak his teachings aloud, not as dogma, but as wisdom. They quoted his words in council. They asked for his presence at every turning point. But it wasn't flattery. It was fear, because those who opposed him vanished, quietly, without spectacle, as if swallowed by the stone itself. No one could prove it. There were no witnesses. But the message became clear. To defy Freedon, Nadd was to step outside the favor of the Force itself. Even the beasts beyond the city seemed to sense it. Their raids on the walls lessened. Their howls grew softer, as if something older than instinct told them this world had a new master now. And he did not roar. He whispered. The king, once a proud ruler with iron rule, now hesitated before speaking in public. He deferred to Nadd's silence. And when he grew ill, as many rulers do when power slips from their grip, no cure could save him. Not that Nadd offered one. A new king rose, younger, sharper, but already trained. Because Nadd had chosen him years before, raised him through influence, shaped him through fear. And the moment the crown touched the young monarch's head, Nadd stepped deeper into the shadows. He had no need to sit on the throne, because he had built it. In the lower chambers of the palace, the true work began. He gathered texts, old Sith manuscripts, fragments of lore taken from Korriban, holocrons etched with forgotten names. He created a council in secret, not of nobles, but of acolytes. Men and women from within Izzies who had shown potential, force sensitivity, ambition, desperation. He didn't call them Sith, not yet, but he taught them how to draw power from pain, how to listen to the Force not as a guide, but as a weapon, how to kill with a thought, or worse, how to bend a thought until it broke. They weren't an army, they were a belief system, and beliefs are harder to kill than soldiers. He gave them tasks, tests, sacrifices, and those who survived became the foundation of something darker than empire. A dynasty, not of rulers, of servants. Each generation trained to pass his will forward, to preserve what the Jedi had tried to erase, to turn Onderon into more than a planet, to make it a memory that would never die. Nadd stood at the center of it all, still mortal, still aging, but untouched by weakness. Because he didn't need immortality of flesh. He was building immortality of influence. The crown above belonged to the king, but the kingdom beneath was his. A kingdom with no borders, no armies, no warships, only fear, only silence, only belief. And in that belief, Freedon Nadd became something far more terrifying than a Sith Lord. He became a myth that walked. Power spreads fastest through children, not because they understand it, but because they inherit it without question. Freedon Nadd understood this better than any Jedi ever had. The nobles of Izzies were proud, rigid, loyal to tradition. But their children, the heirs who would one day rule, were open, curious, hungry, and Nadd fed that hunger with care. He visited the royal nursery not as a teacher, but as a presence. A quiet figure who stood in the doorway while young princes practiced with wooden swords. A shadow who watched the daughters of the court trace ancient symbols they believed were games. He never raised his voice. He never commanded. He simply shaped. A whisper here, a question there, a moment of silence offered at the perfect time. Children remember silence longer than they remember words. Years passed, and the little ones grew, some into warriors, some into scholars, some into rulers. But every one of them carried a piece of him. A way of thinking, a way of feeling, a way of touching the Force without truly understanding what they were reaching for. It began with small talents. A child who could calm a beast at the city gates with a single stare. A princess who dreamed of events days before they happened. A young prince who felt no fear during the beast hunts beyond the walls. The court called them gifted, blessed, touched by fate itself. Freedon Nadd called them something else. The children of the hidden fire. These were not apprentices, not disciples. They were seeds planted in fertile soil, ready to bloom in the next generation. And through them, the dark side seeped into the bloodline, quiet and permanent. He taught them subtle lessons, never naming them, never labeling them Sith. Lessons about control, about the power of emotion, not the rejection of it. About strength born from loss. About clarity that came only through personal suffering. One evening, During a storm that set the palace trembling, he gathered 4 of the children in the lower hall. He lit no torches. He offered no explanation. He simply placed a bowl of black ash before them, remnants taken from the ruins of Sado's tomb. He told each child to touch the ash. Only one obeyed. A girl no older than 10. When her fingers met the bowl, the air shifted. The shadows tightened. Even the storm outside seemed to grow quiet. And Nadd said only one sentence. "You are the beginning." The others watched. They didn't understand, but they remembered, and memory was all he needed. Because in Onderon, kings ruled from above, but legacies grew from below. The children carried their lessons into adulthood. Some became advisors, some became warriors. One became king. All carried Nadd's shadow in their bones. In council meetings, they paused unconsciously before speaking, as if waiting for permission from someone who wasn't there. During rituals, their hands moved in shapes forgotten by the galaxy but preserved in the temple below. When making decisions, they valued strength over consensus, fear over mercy, silence over diplomacy. Not because they were cruel, but because that was what they had been shaped to become. Freedon Nadd watched them grow with a calm, cold pride. He was not raising rulers. He was raising continuations. Vessels for a history the Jedi believed dead. And as he walked the halls of the palace, older now, slower in body but not in spirit, he saw the truth clearly. He did not need an apprentice. He had an entire bloodline. Onderon would never be free of him, because its future generations were already breathing his name, even when they didn't know it. He died without warning. No final speech, no grand ritual, no public farewell. One day, Freedon Nadd simply stopped breathing, and the palace fell into stillness. His body was found in his private chamber, seated in meditation, upright, eyes closed, as if caught mid-thought. There were no signs of pain, no wounds, only peace. But no one believed he was gone, because the darkness didn't fade. If anything, it deepened. The moment news of his death spread, the sky over Izis turned black with storm. Lightning struck the temple roof 3 times. The beasts beyond the walls screamed as if mourning. And beneath the throne, in the deepest chamber, the flame at the center of his sanctum pulsed. Once, he had prepared them for this. The bloodline was already in place. The temple sealed, the teachings encoded. But what no one expected was how quickly his absence would be denied. Within days, his followers declared it a false death, a transformation, a return to the Force so complete, the body was simply a shell left behind. Whispers grew louder. Stories began. Servants claimed to hear footsteps in the night. Advisors dreamed of his voice, giving orders from behind closed doors. Children swore they saw him walking the gardens at dusk, silent, robed, unchanged. And none of it was dismissed. Because the people didn't want him gone. They needed him to remain. The temple became a place of worship. At first, in secret, then openly. Candles lined the halls. Names were chanted. Rituals performed. Not for his return, but for his attention. They no longer prayed to the Force. They prayed to him. Not as a Sith Lord. Not even as a king. As something else. A presence. A shadow that heard them, guided them, judged them. The line between faith and fear disappeared. Rulers would descend to the crypts to consult him. Decisions were made based on how quiet the chamber became. If the flames flickered, they saw it as warning. If the air grew still, it was seen as approval. The royal bloodline became more than family. They became a church. And with each generation, his name moved closer to reverence, then to legend, then to something darker. Because Freedon Nadd hadn't just ruled Onderon, he had infested it. His essence had soaked into its people, its stone, its memory. He had planned for death, not as an ending, but as ascension. And though his body decayed, his voice in dreams, in thoughts, in echoes did not. Some said he could possess the weak. Others said he walked through the walls of the palace still, unseen, choosing successors by whisper. No one could agree on the details, but no one doubted he was still there. Onderon became a world that looked outward, but lived in shadow. A kingdom loyal to a ghost. And the Jedi, they noticed. They had watched the planet grow quieter over the years, felt tremors in the Force, heard rumors of Sith teachings resurfacing, of monarchs wielding strange powers, of a temple the galaxy had forgotten. But they were too late. By the time they returned to investigate, Freedon Nadd had been dead for decades, and yet he was the only name they heard. Not as history, not as fear, as faith. They buried him beneath the palace, not out of duty, not out of grief, but because there was nowhere else that could hold what he had become. Freedon Nadd's tomb was carved into the foundation stone itself, deeper than the vaults, darker than the crypts. No markers, no light, only a sealed passage guarded by silence. The nobles spoke of it as a rite. The people called it sacred. But those who truly understood what had been placed beneath their feet never spoke of it at all, because it was never meant to rest. It was meant to hold. His body was treated with reverence, wrapped in black cloth, anointed with oils laced with Sith alchemy. But it wasn't for preservation. It was for containment. Even in death, his presence could still be felt. The room grew colder around him. The Force swirled in eddies where the air should have stood still. And the shadows on the walls did not always match the torchlight. Those who entered alone never returned the same. At first, the tomb was sealed. Only the royal bloodline had access. Only they were trusted to descend into the silence and return with their minds intact. But as years passed, the stories began. That the king no longer needed advisors. That decrees were spoken behind locked doors, with no witnesses. That some rulers no longer emerged from the tombs speaking with their own voice. The line between legacy and possession began to blur. And still, no one resisted. Because even in death, Nadd delivered. Crops returned to fields scorched by sun. Plagues passed over Aziz as if blind to its borders. Rival dynasties fell to infighting, as if cursed. And the beasts beyond the walls stayed away. To the people, this was proof that their king had never truly died. That he had descended beneath them to protect the city from the inside. And the tomb became more than a grave. It became a nexus, a place where the dark side pooled like water beneath cracked stone. Quiet, still, waiting. The children of the bloodline were taught not just to rule, but to listen. Not to the Senate, not to the people, to the silence. Because sometimes, in the stillness, they said, a voice would come. Soft, direct, familiar. It didn't command. It reminded of duty, of strength, of what the bloodline was built to preserve. Some kings resisted. They ruled with independence. They ignored the tomb. They did not reign long. Accidents, illness, madness. The cost of disobedience was never loud. It was quiet, natural-looking, forgettable. And slowly, over decades, then centuries, the tomb became the real throne. Not physically, but spiritually. The center of Onderon's power was no longer the palace above. It was the corpse below, wrapped in black, unmoving, untouched, and still present. The Jedi might have sensed it had they looked closely, had they listened, but the darkness beneath Onderon didn't roar. It waited, and waiting is harder to detect. So, life continued. Kings rose. Wars came and went. The Republic looked the other way. And beneath it all, the man they had once denied remained. Not as a ghost, not as a memory, as a will, without breath, without rest, without end. A spirit can fade, but a whisper that can live forever. Freedon Nadd had not bound himself to stone or artifact. He had bound himself to people, to the minds and blood of those who had once called him master, to their heirs, and to the heirs that followed. His essence lingered in silence, but it was active, present, watching. The royal bloodline of Onderon had always ruled alone. No council, no senate, no republic mandate. Their authority came from fear, but now it came from something deeper. The Force stirred differently in the line of kings and queens that followed Nadd's death. More erratic, less centered, as if their connection wasn't guided by light, but pierced by something buried deep beneath their lineage. The Jedi never saw the pattern, but the Force did. Every few generations, one child would hear him. Not in dreams, not in voices, but in decisions. A hesitation before mercy, a strange clarity during violence, a sudden knowledge of rituals they had never studied. They would call it intuition. Their advisors would call it fate. But Nadd called it what it was: obedience. His will had not died. It had taken root in the subconscious of a family too proud to question the source of their strength. Some heirs became violent, others cold. Some ruled well, for a time. But none of them ruled alone, because even as they issued orders, they were never quite sure whose thoughts they were speaking. Whispers shaped policy. Whispers whispered back. One king outlawed Jedi contact without understanding why. A queen purged the city archives after waking from a vision of fire. A prince refused to marry, claiming that any heir not born in the temple's shadow would end Onderon itself. The people adapted. They didn't question the curse. They revered it. Superstition replaced religion. Fear became faith. And each generation taught the next to obey the silence beneath the stone. By the time the Jedi finally returned cautiously, politically, with doctrine in hand, they found a royal family that smiled with politeness, but flinched at the mention of light. Onderon had changed. Its rulers did not look like Sith. They did not speak of Nadd in public. They did not build statues. But every night, they lit a single candle in the crypt beneath the palace. Not for ceremony, not for grief, For communication, no king ever claimed to hear his voice. No queen ever confessed to his presence. But every ruler in their final days visited his tomb alone. And none ever spoke of what they saw. The bloodline was not cursed. It was connected. Connected to a man who had never let go. A man who had given them their kingdom, their power, their legacy, and in exchange had asked only for one thing. Remember me. They did more than remember. They became him. Not in name, not in title, in instinct. His way of thinking, his mistrust of Jedi, his hunger for silence, for control, for shadows that lasted longer than sunlight. They wore crowns, but he held the throne. Because whispers, once welcomed, never leave. They echo, they shape, they choose, and through them, Freedon Nadd continued to rule a world that no longer needed his voice, only his will. The first cult did not begin with a ritual. It began with a memory. One night, decades after Nadd's death, a servant claimed she saw a shadow move across the palace wall. She said it walked like a man, stood like a king, and vanished without sound. She whispered this to a friend. The friend whispered to a neighbor. And by morning, half of Izis believed that their dead ruler still wandered the halls. Fear might have died there, but reverence does not die so easily. Within weeks, small gatherings began forming in forgotten corners of the city basements, abandoned storerooms, quiet alleys near the palace walls. They carried candles. They spoke his name. They told stories of his teachings, twisting memory into myth. They called themselves the Veiled, and they believed they were honoring a protector. But they weren't. They were feeding him. Every whispered prayer, every fearful hope, every desperate plea for guidance added weight to the darkness beneath the palace. Because Nadd was not a ghost drifting freely. He was a presence anchored to emotion, to attention, to belief. The cult grew quickly, too quickly. Merchants joined, warriors joined, even minor nobles attended their secret gatherings, pretending curiosity but seeking protection. They believed that if they honored the dead king, his shadow might guard their homes, spare their families, bless their fortunes. But the blessings never came. What came instead were visions. Members of the Veiled began waking in the night, drenched in sweat, gasping for air. Some heard footsteps in their rooms. Others heard whispers behind their thoughts. One woman swore she felt a hand on her shoulder during prayer, a hand colder than stone. None of them stopped, because fear feels sacred when it answers back. Soon, the cult split into factions. Some worshipped Nadd as a guardian. Others saw him as a god. A third group, the most dangerous, insisted he was still alive, trapped between worlds, waiting for the right followers to open the door. They performed rituals in the shadows beneath Izis. Dark chants, small sacrifices, nothing large enough to draw Jedi notice, but enough to thicken the air around the tomb. Each ritual made the silence heavier, more aware, more awake. The bloodline tried to suppress the cults at first. They sent guards, issued decrees, threatened executions, but the more they resisted, the stronger the cults became. Because suppression is also attention, and attention was fuel. Eventually, a strange truce settled over Onderon. The rulers ignored the cults publicly, and the cults pretended their rituals were private. But in truth, Both sides served the same unseen master. Both were shaped by the same shadow. Both were bound to the same presence beneath the stone. And when the dark side flared on storm-heavy nights, during palace births, in moments of sudden death, the cults were the first to feel it. Their leaders collapsed. Their candles blew out. Their voices trembled. Because they knew the corpse beneath the palace had not decayed. The spirit had not faded. And the tomb was no longer a resting place. It was a mouth. A quiet, patient mouth that listened to every prayer and whispered back only one promise. I am not finished. And the cults, shaking, devoted, terrified, believed him. The Jedi came late. They had ignored Onderon for centuries, dismissing its distance, its silence, its stubborn isolation. But the Force had grown, strange, heavy, blurred. The High Council sent whispers first, scouts disguised as scholars, diplomats cloaked as mediators. They expected resistance. What they found was reverence. The people of Onderon didn't speak of the dark side. They didn't speak of Freedon Nadd at all. But every Jedi who walked the streets of Izis felt it. Not fear, not hatred, loyalty. It moved like fog through the alleys. It hummed beneath the temples. And in the crypts under the palace, it watched. The council sent more Jedi. Wiser ones. Cautious. They found signs. Faint Force disturbances. Artifacts misplaced. Ritual scars burned into stone older than the Republic itself. And then they found the tomb. It was sealed behind obsidian, protected by runes the Order hadn't seen since the days of the exiles. They did not open it. They couldn't. The Force repelled them. Not violently. Not like a Sith holocron or a cursed relic. It was gentler, deeper, like an ocean's weight pressing against the door. And then they heard it. Not a voice, not a sound, just a presence, a consciousness beneath the silence, unblinking, endless. They returned to Ossus with warnings, but the galaxy was already unraveling. Wars were coming, the Republic was fracturing, and Onderon wasn't loud enough to matter. So they turned their backs again, left the tomb sealed, left the cults unchecked, left the bloodline intact. Because what they felt beneath that stone was not just darkness. It was defiance. Not of the light, of death. Freedon Nadd had found something none of them could explain. A way to remain, not as a ghost, not as a Sith spirit clinging to hate, but as structure, a system, a design. His name had outlived his flesh. His will had survived his silence. His teachings had passed from mind to mind without ever being spoken aloud. He was no longer a person. He was a pattern. A Force presence tied not to one body, but to a city, to a culture, to a way of seeing power. The Jedi could burn the books, kill the kings, demolish the temple. But the people would still whisper, still light candles, still wake in the night hearing footsteps that weren't there. Because the dark side, when taught correctly, doesn't need a master. It only needs a reason. And Freedon Nadd had given them one. To protect themselves. To reject outsiders. To claim destiny in silence. He had died. But he had not disappeared. And when the Jedi left Onderon for the last time, cloaks heavy, brows furrowed, they said nothing. Because they understood. At last, that they could destroy a Sith, but not a memory. Not a shadow written into stone and blood and breath. Not a kingdom that still lit a single candle for a king whose voice had not been heard in centuries. And deep beneath the palace, within the tomb that no Jedi could breach, a faint ripple moved through the Force. Not angry, not vengeful, just waiting, because one day someone would come, not to end what he began, but to continue it. And when they did, Freedon Nadd would be ready. Her name was Amanoa, and she was born into power, but not into freedom. The bloodline of Freedon Nadd had lasted for centuries, wrapped in silence and strength, its kings and queens reigning beneath the weight of something unspoken. They wore crowns, but they also wore shadows. Amanoa knew that from the moment she could walk, the halls of the palace were colder for her. The candles dimmed when she entered. The servants bowed too low, and the crypt beneath the throne room was never mentioned in her presence, but never forgotten either. She was raised to believe in duty, but she was never taught to ask where it came from. Her mother died young. Her father ruled longer than expected. And when he finally passed in his sleep, Amanoa was crowned queen with quiet hands and silent fanfare. She was not ready. She had not studied war. She had not mastered diplomacy. And the nobles who once supported her father now looked to her not with respect, but with calculation. But something else looked at her too. Something older. In the nights after her coronation, she wandered the palace alone. She couldn't sleep, not because of grief, because of a feeling, the sense that she was never truly by herself. Sometimes she heard footsteps. Sometimes she heard breathing in rooms with no windows. Sometimes she stood at the edge of the throne platform and felt the floor hum. They told her it was pressure, stress, fatigue, but Amanoa didn't believe them, because the deeper she walked into the halls of her family's legacy, the more it recognized her. And then the whispers began. Not voices, thoughts that weren't hers, memories that didn't belong. Old names, old knowledge, pieces of Sith history she had never studied, suddenly arriving in her mind as if recalled, not learned. She found herself repeating ancient phrases during council, dreaming of fire rituals, seeing faces she had never met, men and women with yellow eyes and red blades, standing in dark temples with her blood on their hands. She didn't tell her advisors. She didn't call for a healer. She returned to the tomb, not out of fear, but out of familiarity. It welcomed her. The door opened easily. The silence inside was not cold anymore. She stood before the wrapped corpse of Freedon Nadd, motionless, untouched, undisturbed for centuries. And she knelt, not because she had been told to, not because she wanted to, because it felt correct. In that moment, she didn't feel possessed. She felt seen. All her life, she had been too gentle, too thoughtful, too human for the court. But here, before the one who had ruled without question, she felt no need to explain herself. The dark side did not need apologies. And Freedon Nadd, though dead, though voiceless, was not absent. He had been watching, waiting, listening, and Amanoa was the first of his blood in generations who hadn't fought the feeling. She let it in, not as surrender, but as correction. Because the throne was not just stone, it was memory. And her crown was not just inheritance. It was a summons. The queen who once feared her own name was about to become something the Jedi could no longer ignore. Amanoa's fall did not begin with anger. It began with comfort. The more she ruled, the more the throne felt wrong beneath her, too wide, too cold, too heavy. But the space beneath it, the crypt carved into the ancient stone, felt like it belonged to her. She visited it in secret at first, then in routine, then in need. The council thought she was praying. The people thought she was grieving. But Amanoa wasn't seeking peace. She was seeking understanding. And the tomb answered. Not with sound, not with the clear, crisp voice of a living teacher. The answers came like a memory surfacing from someone else's childhood. Sudden, uninvited, complete. Sometimes it felt like a hand pressed gently against her back. Sometimes like breath against her ear. Sometimes like a thought placed too perfectly into her own mind to be anything but foreign. At first, she recoiled, but the sensation never forced itself. It waited, patient, observant, and that patience broke her defenses more than any command ever could. Her advisors noticed the change. In meetings, she spoke with certainty she had never possessed. She ended arguments with cold confidence. She dismissed entire groups of nobles with a single look that made their hearts drop for reasons they couldn't explain. She didn't shout. She didn't rage. She simply decided. And each decision aligned perfectly with one truth. Onderon belonged to the bloodline. Not the council, not the Senate, not the Jedi. The more she embraced the quiet strength rising in her veins, the more she began to hear the other sounds within the Force. The ones the Jedi had always feared. A hiss beneath her thoughts. A pulse beneath the palace stone. A presence older than her name, older than her city, older than the kingdom she ruled. She knew who it was, long before she admitted it to herself. Freedon Nadd, her ancestor, her shadow, her tutor beyond the veil. He had never left Onderon. He had merely waited for the right heir to awaken him. And Amanoa, vulnerable, uncertain, desperate to be strong enough to rule, gave him everything he needed. She listened. Late at night, when the jungle roared outside and the torches dimmed, she felt him clearest. He showed her how to silence her fear, how to sharpen her emotions into weapons, how to see weakness in her enemies before they spoke. But he also showed her something more dangerous. He showed her purpose. He showed her that her role wasn't to rule for herself, but to continue a legacy the Jedi had tried to bury. The palace guards felt it too. When she walked, the air behind her rippled. Shadows clung to her gown like living things. The beasts outside the walls began howling at odd hours, like they sensed a predator prowling inside the city. Even her husband, King Omen, felt it. Amanoa's presence pushed him aside like gravity-bending steel. His mind weakened. His body decayed. But she didn't grieve. Because she no longer needed comfort. She had guidance. She had authority. She had a voice beneath her throne that told her the truth the Jedi would never admit. She was chosen. Not by tradition. Not by fate. By a man whose shadow had ruled Onderon longer than any crown ever had. And with every whisper she accepted, Amanoa drifted farther from the woman she had been. She wasn't being haunted. She was being shaped. And the Jedi, watching from a distance, sensing something rising but unable to name it, were already too late. Because Queen Amanoa now ruled with two wills inside one body, hers and the echo of Freedon Nadd. The Jedi felt the disturbance long before they saw Onderon. It rippled through the Force like heat rising from a dying fire, thin, trembling, and wrong. Not loud enough to be a threat, but sharp enough to demand attention. They sent only two. Not soldiers, not investigators, just Jedi. Master Archajeth, calm and steady as old stone, and his apprentices Ulic Keldroma, K. Keldroma, and Tot Dunita. Young, hopeful, burdened with the belief that peace could be restored anywhere. They arrived, expecting rebellion. The beast riders had risen again, dragging war toward Izzy's like a storm rolling uphill. Reports spoke of unrest, civil fracture, a queen growing weaker. But none of the warnings mentioned darkness. When the Jedi stepped into the capital, the city felt hollow. Not dead, not frightened, just hollow, as if the life inside it belonged to someone else. The people bowed deeply, too deeply, and their eyes, though polite, held a strange glisten, a kind of quiet obedience that did not match the chaos gathering outside the walls. Master Arca sensed it first, a pressure beneath his feet, a pulse through the stone, like a heart beating from underground. He said nothing, not at first, but his apprentices felt his stance tighten. They walked toward the palace, past banners snapping in the wind, past guards standing too still, past courtyards where even the birds seemed to silence themselves as the Jedi approached. Inside, Queen Amanoa greeted them with warmth that cracked around the edges. Her smile was gentle, her words respectful, but her aura brushed against theirs like cold smoke. Ulic stepped forward to speak, but Master Arca placed a hand on his arm. He felt something old, something watching. Amanoa's voice trembled only once when she mentioned the beast riders. She spoke of savages, murderers, a threat to her reign and her people. She begged the Jedi for help, but beneath her plea there was another tone, a strange undertone of confidence, as if she already knew how the conflict would end. The Jedi promised aid and asked to assess the city's defenses. She agreed quickly, too quickly, and when they turned to leave the throne room, Master Arca paused. His gaze drifted down, toward the floor beneath the Queen's feet. He felt it clearly now. A presence, cold, thin, familiar in a way that made his chest tighten. He had felt something like it in ancient ruins, in forbidden tombs, in places where the Force twisted around old sins. He did not speak its name. Outside the palace, the war became real. The beast riders attacked the city walls with ferocity driven by desperation. The Jedi intervened, blades igniting, movements fluid, calm in the face of chaos. They expected victory. What they found instead was resistance from a power far older than tribal fury. Amanoa had unleashed something, not visible, not spoken, but the battlefield shifted. The beast riders felt fear tighten around their hearts. Iz's defenders struck with uncanny precision. And in the wind, carried between screams and dust, the Jedi sensed a whisper. Leave. Ulic staggered. Kay drew back. Tot froze mid-strike. Master Arca steadied them, pushing against the unseen pressure with calm strength. But even he felt it, a weight pressing against his thoughts, trying to seep in, trying to claim space in his mind. This wasn't the Queen. This wasn't the people. This wasn't rebellion. This was the grave beneath the palace. Reaching upward, the Jedi regrouped. The war was no longer political, no longer tribal. It was spiritual. And as the sun set behind the broken walls, Queen Aminoa stood at her window, watching the distant flashes of battle with a quiet, trembling smile. The Jedi had come, but they had come too late. Because Onderon was no longer her kingdom. It was his. She died before the Jedi could understand her. In the final hours of the conflict, Queen Aminoa withdrew from the throne room. She spoke to no one. She issued no commands. She simply walked the dark halls of the palace alone, barefoot, silent, until she reached the crypt. They found her there hours later, kneeling before Freedon Nadd's tomb. Eyes closed, body still, no wounds, no pain, only release. To the people of Isis, it was a holy death, a passing into the care of their ancestor, a return to the source of their power. To the Jedi, it was something else entirely. Because the moment she died, the Force recoiled. The tomb flared, not in light, not in sound, but in pressure, a wave of cold that spread through the foundation of the city like a heartbeat breaking loose from time. The Jedi stood above the crypt and felt it rise, a presence pressing against their senses, ancient, amused, waiting. Master Arca did not speak. He couldn't. For the first time in years, he felt fear. The funeral was ordered at once. Quiet, formal. But beneath the ceremony, wariness. The people lit candles and wept. The nobles dressed in black and whispered blessings. But the Jedi watched the shadows. Because something had changed. Aminoa's body was placed not in the royal tombs, but beside Nadd. By her own request, no one questioned it. The tomb doors opened. Her casket was lowered, and the moment it touched the floor, the wind outside the palace stopped. Beasts in the jungle fell silent. Fires flickered, and the Force seemed to tighten across the skin of every Jedi standing near. Freedon Nadd had been buried alone for centuries. Now, he had company. Not a queen, not a descendant, a vessel. Because Aminoa hadn't just listened to him. She had opened herself. And when her body died, the echo of him inside it remained. The crypt became something more. It breathed. Later that night, Master Arca descended into the tomb alone. Not with anger, not with hope, with resolve. He reached the burial chamber and knelt. Not in reverence, in preparation. He closed his eyes, opened himself to the Force, and listened. What came was not a voice, not an image, just presence. And one memory, not his own, crashed through him like lightning through stone. A boy kneeling before the Jedi Council. A voice saying, "Your path is not yet clear." And then, silence. Arca opened his eyes. He understood now. This was not about Aminoa, not about the war, not even about Onderon. This was about a man who had once been denied, who had turned that denial into empire, death, and persistence beyond the grave. And the Jedi, in all their caution, had let it happen. They had watched from afar. They had waited. They had hesitated. And now, they had buried one of their greatest threats twice. Not in soil, in faith. The next morning, the Jedi left. They said little. gave no speeches, offered no judgment, because the judgment had already arrived. The palace stood calm. The people praised their fallen queen. And deep beneath the stone, Freedon Nadd's influence pulsed with new life. He had taken a ruler, claimed her soul, and been reborn through her death. Aminoa's legacy would be remembered as noble, strong, tragic, but it would never truly be hers. It belonged to the corpse she chose to kneel beside, and to the darkness that had waited patiently beneath her crown. Galia was not her mother. Where Aminoa had ruled with quiet fear, Galia ruled with visible distance, not cruel, not kind, just absent. She had seen too much. A child of a haunted palace, a daughter raised beneath a whispering throne. She remembered the sleepless nights, her mother pacing the halls in silence. She remembered the servants' eyes, always downcast. She remembered the day her mother died, and the chill that filled the palace before anyone even found the body. She didn't speak of it, not to the court, not to the Jedi, not to the man she would eventually marry, because Galia understood something no one else dared to say aloud. Her mother hadn't died of illness. She had answered something, and in doing so, had left something behind. The Jedi left soon after the funeral, their mission complete. Onderon stabilized. Peace had returned, but Galia knew better. The silence wasn't peace. It was a warning. She ascended the throne with a heart trained by fear, not her own, but her mother's. And while she accepted her crown, she never stepped foot into the tomb. Not once. She ordered it sealed, not defiled, not destroyed, just closed. And she made no effort to explain why. Because Galia didn't want to destroy the legacy of Freedon Nadd. She wanted to contain it. She turned the court toward diplomacy. She welcomed the Republic's attention, restored old trade routes, and allowed Jedi envoys to visit the capital without resistance. But beneath the reforms, she lived like a woman being watched. Because she was. Not by the people, not by the Senate, by something older than both. She married a man named Omen, a noble with charm, intelligence, and an unsettling fascination with the past. He claimed to love her. She believed him. But he asked too many questions about the tomb, about her mother's final days, about the Force. She tried to guide him elsewhere, toward philosophy, toward politics. But Omen was drawn to something else entirely. The why behind the silence. The shape of the darkness left unspoken. And Galia, though queen, was still a daughter. So, she said nothing. She let him explore. Not the tomb itself, but its history, its echoes. She told herself that he would never find what her mother had found. That whatever lived beneath the palace had gone quiet again. But she was wrong. Because Nadd did not wait in stone. He waited in people. And Amin, for all his charm, for all his promises, was listening. Galia watched him change slowly. Late night walks, long hours in the library, new advisors who spoke in riddles and wore colors older than the crown. She said nothing, did nothing, because she believed, foolishly, that silence had worked once, that it could work again. But silence is not a shield. It's an invitation. And deep beneath the palace, the cracks that had once sealed Nadd away began to breathe again. Galia sat on her throne every day, stared out at a city that no longer seemed hers. spoke to a husband who no longer looked her in the eyes, and ruled a kingdom built on stone that never truly slept. She wasn't her mother, but she was still part of the same story, one written in shadows and passed down in blood. The war hadn't ended with Amanoa. It had only gone quiet. And now, it was starting to move again. The palace halls were polished for celebration, but the stone beneath them remained unchanged. It had never forgotten the weight of cloaks trailing through torchlight, or the footsteps of queens who whispered to the dead. When Galia married Omin, it was framed as a symbol of peace, an end to the chaos of the past, a joining of noble lines meant to bring balance to a city once ruled by ghosts. But the ghosts had never left. Omin bowed deeply in the royal court. He smiled in portraits. He spoke of reform, but his eyes moved differently. They lingered on symbols carved into the base of the throne, on cracks in the marble where no cracks should be, on the hidden doors in the lower halls that no one had opened in years. Galia saw it. She felt it, but she said nothing, because she believed that love could pull a man back from the edge. She didn't know that Omin had never feared the edge. He had been born facing it. As her rule continued, he grew quieter, more distant. He claimed illness. His body began to fail. He stopped attending public ceremonies. And yet, his mind sharpened. He spoke in riddles to his aides. He dismissed advisors who questioned his hours spent beneath the palace. He began walking with assistants not from servants, but from figures Galia did not know. Figures who bowed only to him. Whispers rose in the palace that Omin had begun speaking to shadows, that he no longer slept, that he had been seen standing near the sealed tomb of Freedon Nadd, murmuring. One servant claimed she heard him speaking in a tongue she didn't recognize. Another said she saw him touch the tomb's seal with a hand that glowed faintly red. Galia confronted him once, just once. She asked if he had entered the crypt. He looked at her for a long time, and then he said, "I didn't have to." He came out. She didn't ask again, because Galia, for all her strength, had always been the daughter of silence. And silence, once chosen, does not always release its hold. She began walking the palace late at night, retracing her mother's steps, hoping to feel something familiar. But the palace no longer welcomed her. It was colder, not by temperature, but by loyalty. The guards answered her commands. The court obeyed her words. But she could feel it. They were not hers anymore. They were his. Omin's presence had spread like slow poison. Not loud, not violent, just steady. Beneath the floors, in the thoughts of nobles, in the hearts of those too afraid to speak his name above a whisper. She still wore the crown, but it felt heavier. Not with power, with resistance. The tomb remained sealed, but only in appearance. In truth, it had been opened not with tools or brute force, but with invitation. And Omin had not forced his way in. He had offered himself. He had studied the bloodline, learned the rites, embraced the echoes, and in doing so, he had become something Freedon Nadd had waited generations to find. A body that wanted to be used. The wedding had been a celebration, but beneath the music, beneath the vows, beneath the laughter of a city desperate to forget its past, the bones had shifted. Old names had stirred. Old power had flexed. and something long buried had reached upward. Not to destroy, not yet, to remember. Because Nadd did not crave a second life. He craved continuity, and Omin was ready to give it to him. King Omin did not fall into darkness. He crawled toward it, inch by inch, until the man he once was no longer existed. His body broke first. The physicians called it a wasting sickness, a slow collapse of bone and muscle that left him hunched, trembling, and pale. But no medicine healed him. No rest restored him. No prayer eased the shaking in his limbs. Galia wept for him at first. She believed it was grief, stress, the weight of the throne, but the sickness never touched his eyes. Those remained sharp, alive, focused on something she couldn't see. He stopped walking without assistance. Metal supports were built to hold his fragile frame upright. Servants pushed him through the palace in a hovering chair made of iron and wires, a throne of ash disguised as medical relief. But even as his body broke, his voice grew stronger. He began issuing orders Galia had not approved. Edicts spoken through trembling lips but enforced with iron certainty. He reorganized the palace guard, dismissed old advisors, brought in figures cloaked in deep red scholars from forgotten houses, mystics who bowed to no known religion, men who spoke of the old ways in veiled metaphors. He built a new chamber beneath the palace, not beside the tomb, directly above it. A chamber aligned with the tomb's center, shaped to amplify the force that pulsed beneath the stone. Galia demanded answers. He offered none. He only said, "There is work that must be finished." One night, she followed him. She stayed far enough back to avoid the guards, moving through the cold hallways with quiet steps. She watched as Omin's attendants lowered his mechanical chair into a hidden shaft, illuminated by red crystal light. She watched him descend into the depths where even the bravest servants refused to go. And she felt it a pulse through the rock, deep, slow, steady, a heartbeat, not Omin's, not hers, something older. When she confronted him the next day, he did not deny anything. "You don't understand what we are," he whispered. "We are the continuation." His voice trembled with age, but not fear. It trembled with devotion. Devotion to a man dead for centuries. Devotion to a presence that had shaped generations. Devotion to a darkness that had been waiting for someone exactly like him. After that day, Galia no longer entered the lower halls. She no longer slept easily. She no longer pretended her marriage was a union of love. Because she knew the truth. Freedon Nadd had chosen her mother. And now, he had chosen her husband. Omin became more secluded, almost swallowed by the machinery that kept him alive. But the palace felt fuller, as if another presence walked beside him. The air thickened around his chambers. Servants refused to enter. Guards found excuses to patrol elsewhere. Even the beasts beyond the walls howled when Omin passed near a window. He was no longer king by authority. He was king by inheritance. Not of the throne, of the curse. Galia watched her husband transform not into a monster, but into a vessel. His hands shook, his legs buckled, his lungs wheezed, but his spirit burned. He spoke to empty rooms as if giving counsel. He answered questions no one had asked. He recited Sith history with perfect clarity. He dreamed in a language she had never heard. And sometimes, in the darkest hours of night, she heard another voice answer. A voice that did not belong to Omin. A voice that did not belong to any living man. A voice that called her husband by name, and then called him apprentice. It began with a tremor. Soft at first, a vibration felt only in the deepest stones of the palace. Servants blamed earthquakes. Scholars blamed pressure pockets beneath the city. But Galia knew better. The tremor wasn't in the earth. It was in the Force. She felt it at dawn while signing a decree. Her hand froze mid-stroke. Ink bled across the parchment. Her breath vanished for a moment, as if the air around her had been claimed by something unseen. The palace windows shuddered. Torches flickered sideways. And from beneath the throne, a cold wave rolled upward like exhaled breath. A name formed in her mind. Unspoken, uninvited, unforgotten. Freedon Nadd. It had been centuries since the last ruler dared to speak it aloud. But the Force whispered it now as clearly as a heartbeat under broken stone. That night, Galia went to Omin. She found him suspended in the center of a chamber that no longer resembled a room, repulsor lifts humming, metal limbs supporting his fragile body, wires feeding into ports drilled into bone. He opened his eyes when she entered, and for the first time she saw nothing human in them, only hunger. He reached out a shaking hand, and the air around her tightened. "It's time," Omin whispered. She stepped back, fear tightening inside her chest. "Time for what?" He smiled, the way a dying fire might flare one last time. For him to rise again. The tremor returned stronger, spreading across the palace like a ripple through water. Cracks raced up the walls. Dust fell from the ceiling. Servants screamed in distant hallways. Above ground, the citizens of Izis poured into the streets, looking to the sky as clouds spun in unnatural spirals. Lightning arced silently between them, flashing without thunder. And far beyond the walls, the beasts cried out as if warning the world. Galia stumbled as the floor rattled beneath her. She grabbed a column for support, heart pounding as Omin's machinery lifted him higher. He closed his eyes, and the chamber grew cold. So cold, the metal around him frosted. So cold, the torches went out one by one in perfect sequence. When he spoke again, his voice was not his own. It was deeper, older, weighted with centuries. "You sealed me once, child of my blood." Galia froze. Her throat closed. But legacies cannot be buried. Omin's head tilted in a motion that was not natural. His spine arched against the restraints. His mouth opened wider than breath allowed. A second voice layered beneath his. "I return." Stone ruptured beneath their feet. The floor split, revealing the hidden shaft that led directly to Nadd's tomb. A column of darkness surged upward, thick as smoke but moving with deliberate form. Galia tried to run. The darkness reached her first. It didn't strike. It didn't tear. It touched. And for a moment, a brief, unbearable moment, she felt everything. Her mother, kneeling in the tomb. Amanoa's fear twisting into devotion. Generations of rulers bending beneath a weight carried in silence. Whispers turning kings into puppets. A dead man shaping a living world. She gasped and tore herself free, stumbling into the hall, heart pounding, tears falling without sound. Omin's chamber shook behind her. Metal screeched, machinery sparked, and through it all rose the name the galaxy had spent centuries trying to forget. Freedon Nadd. His presence was no longer a whisper. No longer a memory, it was a rival. The tomb was awake, the darkness was moving. And the war the Jedi feared, the one no one had dared to name, had finally begun. Not above the ground, not in the city, but beneath the stones. The Jedi did not come to Onderon with fear. They came with faith. Master Arca Jeth believed the darkness that haunted the world could be healed not with war, not with exile, but with light. He brought with him 2 young knights, brothers in bond if not by blood. One of them was Ulic Keldroma. He was strong, proud, and full of hope. He had read of Sith legends in the archives of Ossus. But like most Jedi of the time, he believed they were buried truths, shadows of a past long gone. Onderon corrected him. The moment Ulic stepped through the gates of Isis, he felt it. Not a sound, not a vision, a pressure, soft at first, like the weight of a memory he couldn't name. It coiled around his spine and sat behind his heart. He didn't speak of it, because Jedi were not supposed to fear shadows, not even ancient ones. But every corner of the palace whispered to him, not with words, with absence. He couldn't explain it, only that every room felt like it had once been filled with something heavy, and that it had never really left. The people bowed, the soldiers obeyed. Queen Galia welcomed them with warmth, but Ulic's eyes kept drifting toward the floor, stone carved with lines that pulsed faintly in the force, marks like veins feeding some deeper organ buried beneath. His brother Kay smiled. Jeth meditated. But Ulic couldn't sleep. Not the first night. Not the second. And when he finally closed his eyes on the third, he didn't rest. He dreamed of voices, not speaking to him, speaking through him. He felt his mouth moving in his sleep, saying names he didn't know. He woke with tears on his face and blood under his fingernails. He told no one. Instead, he walked the halls alone, guided by a sound he couldn't describe. Not footsteps, not wind, just a pull. It led him to the lower levels. He passed guards who didn't see him, doors that opened without his touch, lights that dimmed when he neared. And at the final gate, the one locked by the royal seal, he found it open. Beyond it, silence, thick, complete. A spiral staircase wound down into stone. He followed it. Each step felt heavier than the last. Not physically, spiritually. As if the force was pushing against him. As if some part of it wanted him to turn back. But another part welcomed him. The tomb was cold. Not in temperature, in presence. It was as if the air itself remembered pain. He didn't speak, didn't light his saber, didn't need to. The name was already in the air. Freedon Nadd. It floated there, waiting. Ulic stepped forward, and the darkness recognized him. Not as enemy, not as Jedi, as future. And for the first time in his life, Ulic heard a voice that wasn't his. It said nothing cruel, nothing terrifying. It simply said, "We've met before." Ulic staggered back, but there was no one in the tomb. No phantom, no vision, only the cold. The kind of cold that doesn't come from temperature. The kind that lives in blood. The kind that waits for its moment. He left the tomb in silence, told no one what he heard, told no one how he shook. But that night, while his brothers slept, Ulic sat awake and wondered if the Force had lied to him. because for a single heartbeat in the deepest part of that tomb, he had felt something he was never trained to feel. Not hate, not fear, belonging. In the following days, the Jedi continued their mission. Master Arca Jeth, ever the optimist, believed Onderon had turned a corner. Queen Galia's rule was stabilizing. The beast riders of the jungle had agreed to peace. The rituals of Freedon Nadd had been outlawed by royal decree. But Ulic knew none of it mattered, because the darkness had not been defeated. It had been patient. The tomb hadn't sealed. The air hadn't cleared. And in quiet moments during meditation, in the stillness before dawn, Ulic could feel it watching. He didn't tell his master, didn't tell Kay, because the voice no longer waited for him to sleep. It had found a way in. At first, it spoke in riddles, words that echoed behind his thoughts. Power is not taken, it is remembered. The Force is a tide, you are the shore. He tried to shut it out, tried every technique the Jedi had taught him: grounding, breath control, denial of fear. But the voice didn't need fear. It fed on doubt. And Ulic, despite his strength, had begun to doubt everything. Why had he been the only one to feel the tomb's call? Why had the others felt peace, while he drowned in silence? He wondered if the Force had marked him. He wondered if the tomb had chosen him. One evening, as Galia and her court dined in the upper chambers, Ulic walked the garden alone. The wind was gentle. The trees moved like sleeping giants. But in the space between rustling leaves, he heard it again. You were not meant to serve. His heart froze. He turned sharply. No one was there. Just a statue of a Jedi Knight carved long ago, lightsaber pointed to the stars. He stared at it for a long time. And again, the whisper came. They teach you to kneel, but you were born to stand alone. The voice was not angry, not cruel. It was patient, understanding, kind. That frightened him most, because a Jedi could resist rage. But kindness, spoken in darkness, felt like truth. He went to Master Arca that night, told him part of the truth, that the tomb still stirred, that something ancient was listening. Arca listened with calm eyes. He smiled, as he always did, and placed a hand on Ulic's shoulder. The dark side often reaches out when it knows you're strong, he said. You are not weak, Ulic. That's why it's afraid of you. Ulic wanted to believe that. But deep inside, something else whispered a different message. It is not afraid of you. It remembers you. That phrase kept him awake. He stood before his reflection for hours, studying his face, his scars, the shape of his jaw. And for a moment, he didn't recognize the man staring back. He wasn't afraid of becoming a Sith. He was afraid he already was, and that the Force had simply forgotten to tell him. That night, he dreamed again. But it wasn't a nightmare. He stood on a throne of stone. Armies knelt before him. His saber burned red. And the galaxy was silent, not in death, in peace. A peace built by will, not compromise. A peace the Jedi had never been able to make. When he woke, he whispered 3 words into the dark. He didn't know why. He just did. Freedon Nadd lives. The words didn't echo. They didn't vanish. They settled. And somewhere beneath the palace, beneath the bones and stone and sealed doors, a forgotten corpse smiled. The Jedi believed they were guiding Onderon into a new era. But the past was not finished. Ulick stood in the palace garden one morning, watching the sun rise through amber fog. He hadn't slept. Not really. The voice had gone quiet. But silence, he now understood, was never safety. It was a breath before a scream. In that stillness, Master Arca summoned him. A disturbance had been felt not just by Ulick, but by the Order. Faint, remote, but real. Something was shifting beneath the tomb. They had to investigate. Together, the three Jedi descended into the lowest levels of the palace. Master Arca carried the light as a shield. Kay walked with caution, hand on hilt. And Ulick walked with something cold in his lungs. They opened the vault. The door hissed with ancient breath. Dust poured out like memory. Nothing had been touched. And yet, everything had changed. The air inside pulsed. Not with life, with memory. A presence sat in the center of the tomb, not visible, not even audible, but there. It wasn't angry. It wasn't waiting. It was inviting. Master Arca stepped forward. He began to speak softly, calmly, calling on the Force to bless the space, to cleanse it. But the moment the words left his mouth, the presence moved. Not toward him, toward Ulick. He staggered, dropped to one knee. Kay rushed to help, but Ulick raised a hand. "No," he whispered, "don't touch me." Because something else already was. The presence didn't speak. It entered, not as possession, as memory. Ulick saw visions, not like dreams, more like memories played on a broken holorecord. He saw a throne of bones, heard the cries of Sith acolytes torn apart in fire, saw Freedon Nadd's eyes not as a man, but as a shadow swallowing a galaxy whole. And he felt the touch, not physical, worse, recognition. The presence didn't ask for allegiance. It didn't offer a pact. It didn't seduce. It touched Ulick's soul. And in that single contact, it marked him. Master Arca knew something had happened. He placed a hand on Ulick's chest and closed his eyes. His face twisted. His hand recoiled. And in a voice that shook slightly, he said, "Leave this place." They sealed the tomb again. This time with greater effort, rituals layered on rituals, wards built from ancient scripts, protections etched in bloodlines long forgotten. But Ulick wasn't sealed. He carried the tomb with him. The voice returned that night. It didn't whisper anymore. It didn't need to. It had left its mark. Now it could wait. Because the fall of a Jedi doesn't happen in fire. It happens in layers. And Ulick Qel-Droma had just lost his first. The Jedi departed Onderon, believing their work was done. The war was over. The Beast Riders had been integrated into the cities. The tomb was sealed. Queen Galia had pledged herself to peace. But beneath the stone, Freedon Nadd did not sleep. And in the heart of Ulick Qel-Droma, the darkness did not fade. He returned to Ossus carrying silence. A silence that wrapped around his thoughts like armor. He smiled. He trained. He stood before the High Council and spoke of victory. But he said nothing of the dreams. Nothing of the voice. Nothing of the touch. Because what he felt now was harder to explain. He no longer feared the dark side. He understood it. He had seen its purpose not just as chaos, but as design. The dark side didn't ask for destruction. It asked for clarity. And deep inside, some part of Ulick began to believe that maybe the Jedi were wrong. Maybe emotion wasn't the enemy. Maybe it was the path. But he kept those thoughts quiet. Not even Kay noticed. And Master Arca, wise as he was, chose not to confront what he could not name. The Order had other concerns. New missions. New crises. Onderon was history. But history, as Freedon Nadd had proven, doesn't vanish. It waits. Years passed. Ulick grew stronger. More confident. More admired. He led missions. Spoke at conclaves. Earned respect. But every time he closed his eyes, he heard it. Peace is not balance. Balance is not truth. You cannot destroy what you are. And sometimes, Ulick agreed. The council spoke often of premonitions, of visions warning of darkness rising again in the outer rim. Strange signals, Sith relics activating after centuries. They believed it was coincidence. Ulick didn't. Because deep in his soul, he felt the pattern. He could hear the storm forming. And in the middle of it always he saw a tomb. Buried. Breathing. He began studying forbidden texts. Not in secret, but with justification. To understand the enemy, he said. To know what we face. No one questioned him. Because Ulick was a hero now. Because he had saved a world. Because they trusted him. And trust, in the wrong moment, is how empires fall. One night, he stood alone beneath the Ossus archives. The moonlight touched the statues of ancient masters. He stared at one, then closed his eyes, and said a name. Not loud, just enough for the Force to hear. Freedon Nadd. There was no reply, no vision, no voice. But in the dark side of the galaxy across forgotten space, a shrine cracked. A light went out. And somewhere far beyond the stars, a Sith Lord smiled. Because the first trap had already been sprung. And no one, not even the wisest Jedi, had heard the warning. There was once a Jedi who loved knowledge more than peace. His name was Exar Kun. He was brilliant, bold, respected, but he was also restless. While others meditated on balance, he questioned balance itself. Why should the dark side be forbidden? Why should truth fear shadows? His masters warned him, cautioned him, reminded him that curiosity without humility leads only to ruin. But Exar Kun didn't believe in ruin. He believed in strength. And so, when he heard whispers of ancient Sith knowledge hidden on Dxun, he followed them. When they led him to Yavin the Four, he didn't hesitate. He should have. Because the moment his feet touched that jungle moon, the past began to wake. Long before the Empire. Long before the Clone Wars. Before the Republic even knew how deep the Sith had once gone. There was a tomb. And inside that tomb, a name. Freedon Nadd. Dead in body. But not in will. Buried in stone. But not in silence. As Exar Kun walked among the ruins, something unseen walked beside him. Not a vision. Not a feeling. A presence. It didn't speak right away. It didn't need to. Exar Kun felt it in the vines curling over Sith statues. In the cold that crept into his thoughts. In the way his lightsaber felt heavier in his hand, as if the dark side itself was waiting to be drawn. He told himself he was safe. That he was still Jedi. That knowledge was not corruption. But the jungle knew better. And the spirit of Freedon Nadd had waited centuries for a Jedi just like this. Not one who hated the light, one who questioned it. That was the key. Not rebellion. Doubt. Doubt is the first door. And Exar Kun had already opened it. He found the hidden shrines. He read the forbidden texts. He studied Sith runes etched into stone by dead hands. Each night, the presence grew louder. And then, finally, it spoke. Not in basic, not in sound. In thought, in fear, in temptation. It didn't call itself Freedon Nadd. It called itself truth. It told Exar what he already suspected. That the Jedi were afraid of power. That peace was stagnation. That emotion, not suppression, was the true path to mastery. Exar tried to resist. He meditated longer, tried to clear his mind, but it was too late. The voice was inside now, and it had a name, and a history, and an empire to give. Freedon Nadd did not offer chains. He offered freedom. The freedom to know, to shape, to lead, to command. And when Exar Kun finally stood inside the ancient chamber, when he felt the dark side all around him, warm and infinite, he said the name aloud, Freedon Nadd. And something answered. The jungle went still. The air turned thick, and the last shadow of the Sith Lord rose again. He did not look like a ghost. He looked like a teacher. And Exar Kun was ready to learn. Exar Kun believed he was in control. He believed that the voice he heard was only an echo, a remnant of a dead Sith muttering through history. A curiosity, a puzzle, something he could study, understand, and then rise above. But Freedon Nadd knew better. He had shaped kings, bent queens, broken Jedi. He had waited through centuries of silence for someone like Exar Kun, someone who wanted the truth more than he wanted the light. And the truth, whispered from the grave, can break anyone. The voice began gently. Not commands, questions. Why do you fear what you are? Why should emotion be a prison? Why kneel before masters who deny you answers? Exar Kun tried to ignore them. He trained harder, meditated longer, recited the Jedi code until his throat went dry. But the words felt hollow now, like he was repeating beliefs that no longer fit him. One night, as the red moon of Yavin cast long shadows over the ruins, the voice shifted. It stopped questioning. It started revealing. It showed him visions, memories that weren't his. The fall of the Sith Empire. The last battles of the Great Hyperspace War. Naga Sadow escaping to Yavin IV, building temples soaked in the blood of slaves. Weapons of fear, prisons of will, screams that never faded. And through it all, one figure remained untouched by time. Freedon Nadd. Exar Kun watched as Nadd stood before Sadow's dying fire. Listened as Nadd whispered Sith incantations that twisted the Force into something living. Saw Nadd carve his name into the future with nothing but hunger. These weren't stories. They were lessons. Each vision ended the same way, with Nadd looking straight at him. You are like me, the spirit whispered. You seek what others fear. Exar Kun's breath shook, but he didn't turn away, because deep inside, a part of him agreed. The Jedi taught that knowledge was light, but they treated the dark side as something blindly dangerous, something forbidden. Why forbid something unless it had power? Why deny someone the full truth unless you feared what they might become? The voice pressed harder. You are strong, Exar Kun. Stronger than your master. Stronger than your order. They limit you to protect themselves. Kun clenched his fists. He wanted to deny it. But the words felt like they had always been true. He had simply never dared to say them aloud. His confidence cracked. His faith bent. And the voice slipped deeper. One evening, as Kun touched an ancient carving, the stone beneath his fingers turned ice cold. He recoiled. But the cold didn't leave. It crawled up his arm, spread into his chest, settled behind his heart. And the voice whispered, I can give you what the Jedi never will. Kun fell to one knee, gasping. Not in fear, in shock. Because for the first time, he understood. This wasn't temptation. This was recognition. Freedon Nadd didn't speak to the weak. He sought those who could shape the galaxy. And in that moment, as his heart pounded and the cold receded, Exar Kun realized something that shattered his faith. He wasn't being corrupted. He was being chosen. Exar Kun did not descend into darkness in a single moment. He was guided, patiently, carefully, skillfully. Like a hand placing stones along a path he believed he discovered himself. Freedon Nadd never pushed. He nudged. He never demanded. He suggested. And Exar Kun, proud of his intellect, believed every step was his own idea. The first lesson came in the jungle. Kun was exploring an abandoned temple when the vines shifted behind him. 3 Massassi warriors stepped from the shadows, towering, scarred, their eyes glowing with the remnants of ancient rituals. Kun ignited his lightsaber. The warriors did not. They simply advanced, slow and fearless. He struck first. The blade cut one down, but the other 2 kept coming, their heavy footsteps shaking the ground. Kun backed away. His saber hummed, his breath quickened, and then the voice spoke. Not from the ruins, not from the air, from inside him. Do not defend, Freedon Nadd whispered. Control. Kun hesitated. The Jedi taught restraint, patience, non-violence when possible. But the Massassi lunged. Instinct overwhelmed training. Kun reached into the Force, not the calm pool the Jedi described, but the burning sea beneath it. Power surged through him. He thrust out his hand. The nearest Massassi flew backward with such force that his body cracked stone when it hit the wall. The second followed, lifted and slammed into the ground hard enough to shake dust from the ceiling. Kun lowered his hand slowly. The air tasted different now. Sharper, electric, alive. And the voice murmured, Good. Kun stared at his own fingers, still trembling from the power. It felt nothing like Jedi training. Nothing like peaceful control. This was raw, immediate, instinctive. And it terrified him. Not because it felt wrong, because it felt natural. He tried to meditate that night, but the stillness hurt. Silence made the memory louder, the strength, the precision, the absolute certainty he had felt in the moment. The voice returned when he finally closed his eyes. You are not falling, Exar Kun. You are rising. Kun swallowed. Am I becoming Sith? A soft, cold laugh echoed through his mind. No, you are becoming whole. Another lesson came days later. Kun found a sealed chamber beneath the temple, a place where Sado had once stored relics too dangerous to leave exposed. He knew he should not open it. He knew the Jedi code forbade touching Sith artifacts without supervision. But the presence behind him whispered, "Truth fears no door." Kun pressed his hand to the seal. The stone glowed blue. Lines of ancient script lit up like veins. A low hum filled the chamber. The door slid open, revealing a floating crystal pulsing with dark energy. Kun stepped forward, breath shallow. The voice whispered, "Take it." He reached out. The moment his fingers touched the crystal, a surge of power ripped through him. Not pain, revelation. Images flashed before him. Himself commanding legions, worlds bowing, the Jedi Order fracturing beneath his will. The galaxy bent to a single, unbroken vision. His vision. He dropped the crystal. It clattered on the stone. Kun fell to his knees, gasping. He should have run, should have destroyed it. But instead, he whispered, "What was that?" And Freedon Nadd answered with satisfaction, "Potential." Kun looked at his trembling hands again. But this time, he didn't try to calm them, because something inside him had shifted. He no longer feared the dark side. He feared the limits of the light. And Freedon Nadd, patient as ever, whispered the final truth. "You cannot fall, Exar Kun. When you were always meant to descend." Exar Kun believed he had won. He stood at the heart of the great temple, its spires cracked, its stones humming with forgotten energy. Behind him lay the remains of ancient defense systems, ruined droids, and broken idols of Sith lords long dead. Before him, silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence that comes after something terrible has finally ended. He believed the ghost was gone. Freedon Nadd's spirit had confronted him one final time, rising from the shadows of the tomb that had once birthed his legend. The confrontation had been brutal, not in flesh, but in will. Kun had resisted, refused, denied him. And when the pressure broke, and Nadd's voice screamed out through the stones and vanished into the void, Exar Kun had thought that meant freedom. But Nadd hadn't been trying to possess him. He had been shaping him. Everything from Onderon to Yavin the Four, from whispers to visions, had not been an attempt to dominate. It had been preparation. In the final moment, when Kun cast out the ghost with raw dark side power and shouted that he was no one's puppet, the spirit of Freedon Nadd smiled. Because he knew. The student now believed the darkness was his own. That was the victory. Kun raised the relic staff he had taken from the tomb, a weapon once belonging to Naga Sado himself. It glowed in his hand. He had claimed the temple. The Massassi bowed to him. He renamed their home. And his words, once quiet, now carried the weight of command. But inside, where Jedi still believed truth lived, something had changed. Kun had not become a Sith by oath or ritual. He had become one by belief. He no longer saw the Force as a balance, no longer saw power as dangerous. He saw it as a path. And Freedon Nadd's final whisper, though gone from the air, remained etched in Kun's thoughts. Now, you are ready. History would call what came next the birth of a Dark Lord. But Nadd knew better. It was not a beginning. It was a continuation. The same rage, the same defiance, the same hunger that had once burned in him now lived in another. And it would carry the Sith into war once again. From the shadows of death, Freedon Nadd had created his legacy. Not through blood, not through royalty, but through corruption, Exar Kun walked alone through the jungle one final time before his ascension. He paused beneath the broken statues of the Masasi gods. The night wind brushed his cloak, and though the ghosts were gone, he still felt watched. He whispered aloud to the darkness, "I destroyed you," but no voice replied. Only the sound of leaves shifting, as if something had just stepped back, satisfied. Because Nadd didn't need to speak anymore. Exar Kun had learned everything, and like all students of the dark side, he would believe the lessons were his own. They thought death would silence him. They thought the grave would keep him. But Freedon Nadd had never lived like other men, and he would not die like them either. His body was gone, but his voice, his hate remained. Long after his bones were sealed in a tomb of basalt and stone, the people of Onderon still whispered his name, at first in fear, then in reverence, and finally in worship. It didn't matter that his heart no longer beat, his will did. Beneath the streets of Aziz, in chambers hidden behind false walls and buried libraries, cults formed. Some traced their bloodlines back to the days when Nadd ruled as Shadow King. Others were just drawn by something they couldn't explain. A presence in the dark, a dream that never ended, a voice that wasn't theirs. These followers did not see themselves as traitors or heretics. They saw themselves as chosen, as keepers of an ancient fire. They believed that the Jedi had stolen truth from the galaxy and that Freedon Nadd had tried to return it. They were wrong, but it didn't matter. Belief itself had become a weapon. The dark side had never needed a body to move forward. It only needed memory, and Nadd's memory was stronger than most. For decades after his death, his spirit whispered through the Force, not loud enough to be heard in speech, but deep enough to be felt in fear, in rage, in despair. Any place where the Force bent under suffering, his shadow passed like a cold wind. It touched the dreams of warlords and kings. It poisoned those who already felt anger, and it called to Jedi, who had once doubted themselves. They didn't always know his name, but they felt his presence. One of them was a historian on Ossus. Another was a senator's son from Raxus Prime. Neither lived long, but both uncovered Sith holocrons once thought lost, and both began asking questions the Jedi had buried. Each time a vault was broken open, each time a Sith ritual was uncovered, Nadd's legacy spread a little further. The tomb on Onderon became more than a crypt, it became a fracture in the Force. Even Jedi Masters could sense it, the way light bent strangely around it, the way air felt heavier nearby, the way time itself seemed slower. Children cried when they walked past it. Birds avoided the sky above it. Some said they saw movement within, though no one ever found anything when they checked. It was alive, not with flesh, but with memory. And sometimes, when the wind was just right, it spoke, not in words, but in dread. Those who came seeking power, Nadd gave it to them, but he took something in return. He always did. When a Padawan named Belthalusis visited the ruins with his master, he stood in silence beside the tomb for nearly a full hour. He did not meditate, he did not speak, he only stared. When his master finally touched his shoulder, Belth flinched as if waking from a long, slow nightmare. He never said what he saw, but he refused to go near the dark side again, not even to study it. Not even to fight it. Others were not so strong. Among the descendants of the royal bloodline, the pull was worse. King Amen had once tried to lock away the darkness by sealing the tomb. But even he, The last sorcerer king of Nadd's lineage had fallen to the spirit's whispers. He became little more than a puppet, his broken body animated only by rage, his thoughts clouded by voices he could no longer separate from his own. It was not mind control, it was seduction. Nadd did not command, he tempted. Even after Jedi intervention, even after King Omin's collapse and the attempted purging of the dark side from Onderon, it did not end. The tomb remained, and so did the echo. Artifacts stolen from the planet began turning up in black markets across the outer rim. Sith texts bearing Nadd's name surfaced on Yavin IV, Ren Var, and even the lower levels of Coruscant. Each one carried pieces of his teachings fractured, distorted, dangerous. The Jedi tried to contain them, tried to hide them, but they were too late. The cults spread, and so did the echo. There was a time, long after Freedon Nadd's body had rotted into dust, when his voice still bled through stone. In the buried tombs of Dixun, in the forbidden corners of Yavin IV, and even in the corrupted soil of Korriban, whispers echoed that were not of the living. They came from holocrons, fragments of Sith knowledge, etched in pain, sealed by will. Nadd had crafted them not to preserve wisdom, but to infect it. He had studied the teachings of Naga Sado, warped them, and bound them into devices so cruel they could not be opened without offering something first: fear or flesh. They weren't libraries, they were traps. And yet, the Jedi never destroyed them. They couldn't, because to destroy them meant first understanding them, and to understand them meant hearing the voice. The voice that promised power, the voice that knew the codes, the voice that remembered every failure the Jedi tried to forget. Centuries after Nadd's death, Jedi archivists still debated the danger of his relics. Some wanted them sealed, others believed they could be purified. But none of them noticed the pattern. Every time one was studied, someone fell. Not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, thoughtfully. It began with questions, then dreams, then shame, then anger. 1,000 years before the rise of Darth Sidious, there were already Jedi walking quietly away from the Order, never out of rage. But because they were convinced the Force had lied to them. Because something else had begun to whisper, something that remembered their names. One of Nadd's holocrons was found by a Jedi Knight during a scouting mission on the far edge of the Stygian caldera. The Knight was alone. The object was half buried in obsidian. He did not report the finding. He brought it back in silence. And 6 years later, he was no longer a Jedi. His name was struck from the records, his lightsaber crystal shattered in the archives. The temple said only this: he was not lost. He chose to walk a different path. That path began with Freedon Nadd, but it never ended with him. Because Nadd did not teach the final steps, he left that for others. He offered fragments, broken ideas, cracks in the armor of Jedi thought. Enough to make you doubt, enough to make you hunger. He did not want followers, he wanted successors. The holocrons were his messengers, silent but never sleeping. On Malachor, long after it was forbidden, after the Mandalorian Wars ended in silence and dust, a lost Padawan found a vault beneath the surface. In the dark, she felt the presence of others. She thought they were memories. They were not. They were echoes of Nadd's teachings passed down by cults that had splintered and scattered, worshipping no living king, but a dead god whose mind refused to fade. Those cults had no name, no face. They were fragments themselves, but they all traced their lineage to one place, Onderon. To one tomb, one whisper, Because in the end, Freedon Nadd had become what every Sith desired, unavoidable. He didn't need armies. He didn't need a throne. He had achieved something far more permanent. He had become a story. And stories, in Star Wars, are harder to kill than flesh. Jedi Knights could fall in battle. Sith Lords could be betrayed. Temples could be turned to ash. But a voice carried by shadow, by time, by the cracked crystal inside a forgotten holocron, that could live forever. There were times, centuries later, when Jedi who touched those relics felt the air grow cold. Even in sunlit rooms, they heard a name, not shouted, but breathed into their spine. Freedon Nadd. Some believed they were imagining it. Others didn't speak at all. Because they knew. They knew that, even though his bones had vanished, his words had not. And if you listened long enough, they began to make sense. Not because they were true, but because they knew your fear better than you did. The city of Izzy stood like a scar on Onderon stone built atop silence, walls thick with the memory of pain. But what grew inside those walls was worse than any siege. It was inheritance. Freedon Nadd had not only corrupted kings, he had corrupted blood. When Queen Aminoa died and her husband vanished into shadow, their daughter Galia tried to cleanse the palace. She opened the windows. She burned the robes. She ordered the crypt sealed again. But you cannot burn the air. The moment she sat the throne, the darkness returned. At first, it was small. Dreams, whispers, a voice echoing in empty halls. She dismissed it as grief or memory, but there were moments, just moments, when her hand moved before she thought. When her words grew sharp. When her fear of the Jedi became more than political. Because deep below, in the catacombs beneath the palace, the tomb of Nadd had never truly closed. His body was gone, but the power remained, and it clung to her blood. Galia had hoped that her son would never feel it, that the curse might stop with her. That light, once invited in, might cleanse what shadow had touched. But hope does not break legacy. Her son, Omin, was sick from birth. Not with plague, not with wound, but with something the medics could not explain. His bones withered, his nerves collapsed. The Force twisted around him like a noose. The Jedi believed he was fragile. But the truth was worse. He was being reshaped. Freedon Nadd had found a vessel. And over the years, as Omin's body broke, his mind did not. His hatred grew sharper than his bones, his curiosity deeper than his pain. By the time he was 20, he had found the tomb. And the tomb had found him. What followed was not ceremony, it was infection. Omin called it study, but it was possession. In the dark, surrounded by bones of kings and broken relics, Omin learned how to speak without words. He spoke through the Force, through anger. He began gathering followers, not by fear, but by certainty. He told them the Jedi were liars, that peace was theft, that power was a right denied to their family by outsiders. And they believed him, because Omin had the voice, not his own. Nadd's. It whispered through him when he spoke, it curled around his words. Even when his mouth was silent, his eyes were loud. Galia tried to stop it, but it was too late. She had ruled by treaty, by compromise. Omin ruled by blood. He turned his palace into a fortress, the catacombs into a sanctuary. The sickness that had nearly killed him became armor machines wrapped around his broken body, keeping him upright, but never whole. And when Jedi voices rose again on Onderon, he did not run. He prepared. Because Omen wasn't waiting to defend the legacy. He was planning to expand it. The cults that once whispered in corners began to walk openly in his court. Rituals returned. Symbols carved into stone long ago reappeared, freshly painted. Servants wore them. Guards bowed to them. Even the children were taught that Nadd was not a curse. He was a king, and kings do not die. In the darkest part of the tomb, Omen found a holocron sealed by bone one even Nadd had feared to open. He broke it anyway. Inside were teachings so old they predated language. Teachings that traced not to the Jedi, not to the Sith, but to the moments before both had names. They were not commands. They were choices, and Omen made his. When Jedi envoys arrived again, when Master Archegeth and his students returned to investigate the unrest, they were not met with fear. They were met with ceremony. Omen welcomed them like a host, but it was a trap, not of weapons, not of soldiers, of history. Because the Jedi did not come to fight, they came to reason, and Omen knew that was their weakness. He led them through his palace. He spoke of peace, but beneath his words, Nadd was already preparing the ritual, already whispering to the bones, already calling to the dark places beyond the stars. This was not a return. It was an awakening, and Omen was no longer sick. He was crowned. The Force remembers, even when flesh forgets. When Omen fell, when his machines were shattered, and his broken body silenced, the Jedi believed it was over. They buried him deep beneath Aziz, alongside his ancestors, sealed the tomb again, placed barriers of light. And for a time, Onderon was quiet. But quiet is not peace. Below the surface, beyond sound and beyond time, the energy stirred. It had no name anymore, no voice, only hunger. Freedon Nadd's final victory was not in kings or palaces. It was in survival, not as a man, but as an echo. The cults scattered again. Some were hunted, others faded into obscurity, but a few remained, not as armies, but as seeds. Whispers passed from teacher to student, marks carved behind loose stones, names spoken in sleep, and each time the galaxy forgot him, he returned in a different form. In the mind of a curious Padawan, in the pages of a forbidden archive, in the hand of a Sith acolyte who didn't know who he was imitating. Because legacy doesn't need memory, only repetition. One day, centuries after Onderon's last war, a child touched the stone walls of an ancient ruin and cried without knowing why. Her mother told her it was nothing. It was not nothing. It was presence. Some said the dark side was an infection. Others called it a choice. But Nadd had become something worse, something simpler. He had become a shape in the Force, a groove. A rut carved so deeply that any Jedi who fell even slightly risked sliding into it. Because the dark side doesn't need to shout. It only needs to wait. And Nadd had learned how to wait. Long after the Great Sith War, after Exar Kun's empire collapsed and the Massassi temples crumbled, his teachings resurfaced on planets he had never visited. Tombs bearing his symbols emerged in caves that predated civilization. Archaeologists thought them ancient, but they were not. They were recent imitations. Proof that Nadd's teachings hadn't just survived, they had evolved. Not in form, but in function. They had become instinct. He didn't need to appear. He didn't need to speak. The Force itself remembered what he had taught. That pain brings clarity. That truth lies in hunger. That death is not the end, but the beginning of influence. The Sith who came after those who named themselves Darth often believed they were original, innovators, monsters of their own making. But Nadd was there, hidden behind their ambitions, not guiding them, but echoing in them. He was the first to fall, not for vengeance, but for understanding. The first to kill his master, not out of hate, but hunger. The first to turn an entire world, not by war but by idea. He did not want obedience, he wanted memory. And memory is harder to kill than flesh. When Darth Bane rose, thousands of years later, he would read the histories, he would study the wars. And somewhere, between the pages, Nadd would be there. Not mentioned, but present. Because Bane understood something no other Sith had. Power must be focused, not spread. And that idea, that single, cold truth, had lived in Nadd long before it had a name. Freedon Nadd was not the strongest, not the cruelest, not the most feared. But he was the most infectious. Even now, his name is barely spoken. Even among Sith, he is a shadow, a prelude, a myth buried beneath louder myths. But that is the final trick, because he wanted it that way. Oblivion was never his fear. Obscurity was his weapon. And in that, he became something the Jedi could never destroy. Not a king, not a ghost, but a path. One that would wind its way through the centuries, through ruins, through rituals, through the lives of Jedi, who would never know why they fell, only that they did. They would call it fate. They would call it weakness. But it was him. It was always him.